Thank you all for joining us. I would like to call this special meeting to order.
Is your mic muted, Dick?
No. May I have a motion to call? I'd like to call this special order to meeting. This special meeting to order. Sorry, I've got the wrong thing in front of me. Mrs. Stein. Second by Mr. Brown. Thank you for joining us at the special meeting, the board retreat. We will open it up to public comment. Michelle, if you're ready.
Good morning. If you would like to speak during public comment, please click the participants icon on the bottom of your Zoom screen. Next, click the raised hand option. You will notice a blue hand icon appear in the upper corner of your screen where your face, name, and/or number appears. When it is your turn to speak, the facilitator will identify you and announce that you are unmuted for public comment. Once recognized and unmuted, please state your name and address. You will have up to 3 minutes to comment. There is no public comment at this time.
Thank you, Michelle. Thank you for all those out there in Zoom land that are joining us. We appreciate you paying attention. We'll move then to board self-evaluation. We have Ms. Patrice McCarthy joining us from CABE. I want to thank everyone for taking the time over the last couple of weeks to fill out the CABE evaluation and send those in. Patrice, we're excited to have you here. I know you've worked with us before and you've helped us before and guided us before, so we're looking forward to the conversation. So without further ado, I will turn it over to you and Dr. Adley.
Patrice, good morning to you. Welcome. Thanks for the drive down. Good morning to all the members of the board and our cabinet this morning. Thank you for investing the time in the evaluation process, because I know it took a wee bit of your time to do so. And I'm delighted to welcome back Patrice. And Patrice is the Deputy Director and Legal Counsel to CABE. And I think I said this last year, she does a phenomenal job both on the legislative floor and just working with boards and superintendents. So with that, we're glad to welcome you back and for you to frame the discussion this morning and lead the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Sounds like.
Thank you very much, and I really have to commend you for taking the time. I was here just about a year ago. It was my first in-person meeting during the pandemic. It's delightful to be back in a little more relaxed environment than we all faced a year ago. But the fact that you take the time each year to go through this process is extremely important. The board self-evaluation is key to making sure that you are as effective as possible as a board, and that your leadership team, meaning the board and the superintendent, are working together for the maximum benefit of the students in BOE. So thank you for taking this time. I'm going to try and make it as productive as we can for the next about an hour and 10 minutes. What I will do is, I have looked at the self-evaluations that you filled out, meaning they're tabulated by one of our administrative assistants. So I don't know what individual board member responded in their individual submissions. That's by design. So just know that you may have made a comment, and you may say, well, why hasn't Patrice addressed this comment that David made? Well, I don't know that David made the comment. I just look at the summary, and what we do is, what we have found over the years is that this is a great tool. It's not about rating a board or rating any individual board member, but it's a great tool to use so that we find the areas where the board as a whole says, wow, we're really doing great. And it's important to pause, especially after this incredible year that we've all been through, and say, let's take a minute to celebrate some real successes as a board. Also look at areas where maybe a number of board members say, we could do better. And out of those we can do better might come your board goals. So that will be the second part of our discussion, to set maybe 3 or 4 goals for the board, different from the goals that you have for the school district, different from your strategic plan, but things that as a board you agree you would want to work on in the coming year. And then the third thing I look for are areas where the board is essentially all over the map. Some board members think you're doing great, and some board members think, wow, we really need a lot of work on in this area. So this is based on the document that you all have seen, and it's up there on the screen, that was developed by CABE and CAPS a number of years ago. We review it periodically, and what it is it's a tool. It's not a law, it's not a policy. It's simply a tool to help facilitate a discussion. So that's how we've used it, and that's how we've used it in boards for probably about 20 years, with some revisions along the way. So we're going to talk about board goals, and we're going to remember that those are very distinct from the district goals, which are very much operational. Let's see. I think we'll start then with just going through the things that I noticed as I looked at your self-evaluation responses. So I'm going to begin with the vision. And I would say in the vision area, you have a lot to celebrate. The fact that there is wide consensus that you have a real focus on student achievement. That's key. There's a reason that that's the number one thing that we identify in this evaluation instrument. That's what you're about. You're the only body in the community that has student achievement as their primary focus. And remaining committed to that, having that the overarching premise every time you make a decision as a board is really key. Now, within the vision area, one of the questions has to do with the board using the policy manual to create a culture that supports the vision and the goals of the district. And that's an area where there is some differentiation in your perspectives as to how you're doing as a board. And the policy issue comes up in a couple of other areas as well in some of your responses. One thing that we have found that can help a board make sure that they're matching policy with their decision making is thinking about whether you want to include, as you have action items on your agenda, the reference to the policy that actually governs that action item. Again, a suggestion, and there won't always be an absolute match between, well, there's a specific policy and here's this action. But where there is, that can help connect those issues together. Another area to celebrate within the vision is that you communicate the goals and expectations of the district, and with an emphasis on high achievement. Clearly, you are fortunate to be in a district with high achievement. That also means that you have a high bar for measuring success. Your community has a high bar for measuring success, but making sure that you as a board keep that focus is incredibly important. You're doing it now. Keep working at that and recognize that that is something to be celebrated. Similarly, making sure that the goals that you do develop align with the vision and mission, and we're going to talk about that a little more at the end. Do you have questions or comments or other things you want to raise within that overall vision discussion?
Anyone?
Okay.
Mr. Sini.
Go ahead,
I
John.
would just comment, I think the vision, I think we covered a lot with the strategic plan and such. So
Exactly.
we're all sweet.
Yeah, and that, I also have to say, working on a strategic plan is critical, and I know that was part of the discussion, I think, a year ago when I was here, that you were embarking on that. All right, community leadership. This is an area where I see some significant variation in the perspectives of the members of the board. So let's spend a little time trying to sort through that. Some of it has to do with the board's role in communicating with the public. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about the roles and responsibilities section here. It is clear that under state statute, you only have power when you come together as a body in a public meeting. Now, that doesn't mean that you don't interact individually when you're in the grocery store and at the soccer fields or wherever else you are in your neighborhoods. But one of the important things to remember is that the public perception of you as a board member, while you know that you only have power when you come together as a body, the public perception is that each one of you individually could turn the school system around on a dime if only you'd get to it. So when someone approaches you, and I used to use the example of the bus stops, but now we have so many more relevant, exciting, hot topics. So when someone approaches you and says, you're gonna make sure that our kids don't have to wear masks when school starts in the fall. Or someone else in the next aisle of the grocery store says, you're gonna make sure that our kids do have to wear masks because they're elementary age and they can't be vaccinated, and I'm very worried. And so you as a board member don't, A, have the power, even if it wasn't a public health issue, and B, if the public health requirement in Connecticut is that we have masks or that we are not required to have masks, that's the directive that as a body, boards of education will have to follow. So helping the public understand the role of the board, and the interesting thing about the year that we've just been through, particularly with the opportunity for members of the public to engage virtually, is that I think there has been more interest in what boards of education do, more sort of aha moments for the members of every community that, oh, there's a board of education, and they have certain powers and they don't have these other powers. They can't just say, well, never mind, we're not going to contact trace because, you know, it's messy and it's going to mean that we find kids and families that have to quarantine. We just won't do that. No, you have to do that if that's the public health directive. So I think that as we go forward, I think you have a real opportunity to be able to use that new interest, which can sometimes admittedly be overwhelming interest, but use that to keep those lines of communication open in terms of the understanding of the public of the role of the board as a policy-making body that has to operate within the constraints of state law, public health directives, governor's executive orders, and everything else. One of the areas within community leadership is promoting the accomplishments of the district. And again, there's some differentiation in terms of how you feel about, how you individually feel about how the district is doing that. So I would just point to that as one area where you might want to think, are there other things that you can do? Are there ways to highlight student achievement? I'm not talking about just test scores. I'm talking about, for instance, civic engagement of students, looking at a variety of ways that your students shine individually or collectively, impact that they have had, for example, on the community.
Can I interject for a second?
Absolutely.
When you say that, do you mean as a board? You know, a lot of times things are celebrated at a building level, at a school, or can you talk a little bit about, as a board, what's the best practice in terms of us celebrating certain achievements and things you've seen?
One of the things that I've seen is having students come, and again, you know, let's look as we go forward when we will be gathering together, or virtual participation as well, but having a section on some board meetings where you highlight some student projects, some student accomplishments. We actually used at CABE the two student representatives on the State Board of Education as presenters at a webinar that we did for board chairs over the past year. Incredibly articulate young people, reflecting on their experience as learners during the pandemic, and then as new college students, because we did this after they had started their freshman year of college. But things like that where people can actually see, and it's great for the board, it's also great for the community as well. So it also reminds you of why you're doing this rather underappreciated community volunteer work, that the accomplishments of your students, and I do want to emphasize on a whole spectrum of not just the students that have the highest SAT scores or have taken the most AP courses, that those are important, but looking at ways to recognize and appreciate a broad range of accomplishments.
Just an example that I'm familiar with is just like students in the spotlight, and like it would be every other week, every other board meeting, students would come and you profile something. Now, on the other side of that, no matter what you're adding to the agenda, there's a decision to be made there. Other things of celebrating is like teaching and learning. We don't, for a wee simple example, we don't have Teacher of the Year. We don't participate in Paraprofessional of the Year. Those are things that would celebrate teaching and learning, promote the profession as well as the student part of it as well. But anyway, that's just an example.
Yeah.
If I may, one of the things that, I don't know if this isn't on. Right. So one of the things I envisioned also, if we had a board communication policy, is like celebrating how successful we were in a return to school in present, basis model this past year, to make parents realize and the community realize, the lengths that this administration went through to get kids back in school, and how successful on a relative basis we were throughout the state as well. So it's things like that, I think, bigger picture too.
Absolutely. It's not, people are sometimes reluctant to tout their successes, but just like who else, if you don't advocate for the students, who else has that responsibility in the community? If you don't celebrate the successes and bring that to the attention of your community, there's not somebody else out there waiting to do that for you. So it's a perfectly appropriate role of the board. Now, there are a couple of things in this category that you identify that I think I can give you some help in ways to do it better. One talks about collaborating with other school boards, superintendents, to inform federal, state, and local policymakers about education issues, and as well as providing providing community leadership on educational issues. We are your statewide organization. We are here that's a big part of the work that we do. And for example, the collaboration that has happened during the past year among the chairs of boards of education. We began by doing weekly board chair check-ins last March. We've now transitioned to doing those on either once a month or twice a month basis, but we will continue to do that for the foreseeable future, because that opportunity to connect with other districts around the state, without having to leave, without having to do miles on 95, that opportunity to share, to learn from colleagues, we think is very worthwhile. In addition, in terms of advocacy, we provide a vehicle to do that. You can provide testimony on issues of concern. You can be in contact with your legislators. You have those routes, and we have the tools to, when there's an issue that really resonates with your board that you want to speak out on, you know, we're the people that can let you know where it is in the process, who best to be communicating with. So use us in that way. It doesn't have to be as daunting as it might seem, like really one more thing that we're supposed to be taking on, or one more thing that we're going to ask our administration to help us do. Use us as that resource, and that's, you are elected by the same constituents that elect your legislators in Hartford. So making sure that you use those connections, that you give them that input, is really important.
Patrice,
Tara.
can you help us a little bit? And I think this year highlighted it, just because, you know, going through a pandemic, people get very strong opinions. There's a lot of emotion, there's a lot of experience. And I think individually we might feel something, we want to speak about it. Social media provides us a lot of ways on that. And as a board, we've had to talk about the table. But is there any advice from CABE about how, as board members, we kind of separate out our individual opinions out in the world versus board opinion or board responsibility? Because I think sometimes that's really hard, given all the conversation. And then, to your point, the perception when we're answering people. How are they perceiving our answers?
Right. Great question. And there is no bright line. I mean, if it was easy, you know, we'd just give you the formula and say, here's the bright line, do this, you can't do this, and we can keep it completely separate. What I would say is, you certainly as board members don't lose your right to speak individually. Now, that's less complicated when you're speaking on issues that don't impact public education. So, you know, if you're speaking about tolls on 95, that's a little different than speaking about vaccines for school-age children and masks and the history curriculum, and I could go on and on. I don't think we're going to run out of issues that are hot button issues anytime in the near future. I don't think the end of the pandemic is going to be the end of hot button issues. So you still have that right. I think what's important is that if there are topics that you as a board discuss and have consensus on that are, you know, state or federal level issues, that then, for instance, you can adopt a board resolution that says the Darien board urges the legislature to do X or not do Y. So you have that because you've had a conversation and you've been able to reach consensus. Now you know, that's not going to be on every single issue, and you're not going to be able to take up your board meeting time where you're trying to move the issues impacting the district in the next week, month, and year forward. You're not going to have time to address 15 issues. But if you sense that there are one or two issues that you can reach consensus on, then those are the ones to tackle, I would say. But don't let it, there is that balance between don't let it distract you from the things that you know you have to act on that are priorities for the community today. So it's a balance between dealing with the immediate issues, but also recognizing that there are some overarching policy issues that are decided at other levels of government that do impact public education.
Can I follow up with that? One of the things which ties into a later agenda item is we have this communications working group, and one of the things we've all been talking about is, do you see a lot of do you see a lot of boards having their own social media accounts? Is that something you recommend, don't recommend? Can you give us some guidance on that? Because I know we're going to talk about it later, and you obviously know what other people are doing.
Yeah.
So.
We don't advise that boards have their own social media accounts. You have to remember that you are still subject to the Freedom of Information Act. So if it's a board account, then all those rules about, retaining communications and making them available to the public. Now, I realize on social media they're perhaps incredibly available to the public, but you also would have to be very careful about who posted, how they posted, whether that was whether they were posting the position of the board. That's why, for instance, we have always said that it's important that there really be one spokesperson for the district. The way to build public confidence and trust is to make sure that there is clear, consistent communication. And if the public is hearing one thing in an email from the superintendent, a little something else on social media, a little different version on a board member's Facebook page, that then stirs a lot of anxiety, confusion, no matter what the issue is, whether it's a public health crisis or whether school is going to be let out early because the temperature is too warm in some of the classrooms. So I would be very cautious about that, because I think it becomes, I think that the potential downsides probably outweigh the upsides. David.
Thanks, Patrice. Just following up on that, so I know we're talking about different mediums, a website versus a resolution, but how do you distinguish the confusion or other things that people have slightly different opinions, or how you keep the message consistent? Because wouldn't you have the same risks of inconsistency in message regardless of medium?
Well, I think that if you've come to consensus as a board and, for instance, adopt a resolution, then you've got something that has four corners to it, and that's the board's communication. Just like when you adopt a policy, you're bound by that policy. You may have had discussions that reflected slightly different opinions, but at some point you took an action and agreed to that document. So I think that's the difference. The prevalence of all sorts of platforms where people can communicate instantaneously and individually. Now, people post things at 2 o'clock in the morning that maybe at 7 a.m. they realize was not the best thing to be communicating. And I'm not talking about school board members. I'm talking about those other people out there. So I think that's the distinction I would make.
Got it. So I guess the question I would follow up with that is, so if we publish in a press release or a resolution per se, that's a snapshot, it's fixed.
Yeah.
If we post to, say, a social media site, a statement or a snapshot, that's fixed also, so should be okay. It's really just the commentary, the back and forth, the interaction is where risk starts to come in?
Well, and even who's doing I guess the question is who's doing the posting. If it's not a post that reflects actual board discussion or board action, then it's subject to interpretation by each member of the board. But you do raise the important issue of, then you get into the discussion back and forth. So once you open that door, you can inadvertently create an illegal public meeting by commenting. So I'll use Facebook. So one of you posts something on Facebook, and you're as board members, you're all friends on Facebook. 4 other members post other comments about your original post. And the post has to do with something that pertains to the Board of Education. You have now essentially engaged in a conversation that should happen at the board table, not on Facebook. And the risk of that, because communication is so, the same thing applies to email, frankly. We've all become so used to, well, gee, this is such an efficient way to get information out, that we don't necessarily stop and think, wait a minute, in my role as a public official, I've got to be cautious about how I use that. And it's not that you intended to create, there's no ill intent here, it's just the inevitable, you post something, other members of the board are interested in talking about it, and they do it on social media. Yes, Jill?
One of the things that we run into that kind of Katie's question is a little bit stemming from is we are looking at our communication in the wake of a crisis. So very often, if it's something where you get to the point of a resolution, you've had some time to deliberate and it can follow the natural course of government. But we found during this period of time that we needed some type of crisis communication. So, and in the absence of that, there was a lot of communication happening on social media, sometimes in an entirely wrong direction. So what are you advising boards in the wake of this crisis about how they sort of reformulate themselves from a communication perspective to be a little more just in time?
Again, I think this is an issue that does have to start with the administration, because the messaging about, crisis issues and the need for a single spokesperson, particularly in a time of crisis, starts with the administration, the superintendent, and the chair of the board. Those are the people that should be making the decision on what needs to be communicated, how it needs to be communicated, looping in the board, obviously, if there needs to be board action. When you're talking about a true crisis, you've got other, generally community officials involved in helping make that decision. So if it's police and fire or public health, they are advising as well. Here's what you have to do. It's not subject to board vote. You have to close the building. You have to quarantine. You have to whatever the response to the crisis is. In terms of sort of, then there's the moment of crisis often, and then there's all right, now how are we going to best deal with this issue that we've been confronted with? Mm-hmm. And then that's when there will likely be a special meeting of the board, a discussion about how do we proceed. If we've had to close a building, are we going to be able to reopen it? Can we repair it? How are we going to house the students in the meantime?
So those are examples of sort of operational issues.
Yep.
We had some questions of things that were deliberated at the board, interpreted very differently by the public, or we had times when we were having trouble getting our board meetings. I think one time it wasn't, we couldn't get it up on YouTube, and there was some communication. So I'm a little bit different than some of the operational crises. We were having things that the board needed to communicate about in a very timely manner.
Again, I would say the best vehicle is a consistent message that the superintendent, the board chair sends out in whether it's posted on the district website, whether it's an email blast to your families, whether it's the phone notification system, again, depending upon the timeliness, the level of urgency, and just making sure that message clearly and consistently reflects whatever the discussion was. I think one of the dark holes that all of us as a society sometimes fall into is trying to respond directly to specific pieces of misinformation, because as soon as you straighten out one piece, there's another one over here, and there's just no end. So keep being very clear in your own messaging. This is what the board decided. This is what we have to do. This is the guidance of public health. Just making that very obvious, and hopefully then that allows people to say, oh, well, this is their message, and they didn't say whatever the rumor is or whatever the misinterpretation is.
Go ahead, sir.
So, building on that, what do you think best practice is when we are on social media, or we are alerted to social media that there is a post that is false misinformation. As a board member, I found it frustrating not responding to that, and I have not responded to those because I do not want to misconstrue the other 8 people's opinions, and it's not my role. But what is best practice when there's misinformation out there? And I think we saw this year, that one gets here and then it blows up and it blows up and it blows up. How do we clamp it down? How do we handle something like that?
One thought would be, if you're going to post anything, simply reference, for instance, if there's a post on the district website, if there's a communication from the superintendent, reference them back to that. Don't provide your own personal commentary about it, but this issue is addressed in the district website under recent board actions, or wherever that accurate information is contained.
And if they want to then get into a back and forth with you online,
I wouldn't.
yeah.
I don't think any good public purpose is served. Let's put it that. I mean, can you do it? Yes. But are you helping build understanding? Probably not.
Patrice, is there any value kind of yearly to kind of reiterate to the public board roles? Because I think most people here would agree, often what happens is, let's say someone doesn't like the answer they got, right? Superintendent didn't give me the right answer. Board, you need to get involved,
No,
right?
that
Sorry,
never
Alex.
happens. Well, it never happens here.
Yeah. A previous superintendent didn't give me the right answer. And so I think, people want to go to, there's one view, like we want to go to our representatives. Our representative, we don't like the decision.
Yeah.
And I think sometimes board members do feel that pressure of like, well, I want to be responsive. But there seems, I would say one of the things that I think we need to work on, kind of a reiterating of the rules, we only work as a body, right? So I will take that into consideration as I have my conversations, but I can't jump out and agree with you or send a letter to the super, or, I can say, here's where you should contact the super and let them know that you're concerned, or the board chair, but I feel like, and I'm a little worried our conversation later is gonna look to make broad policy on a very unique year, and we'll have to deal with that. But I don't know that the pandemic is our year to say this is how things have been done, because things were done differently. To Mrs. McCammon's point, like, who knew Zoom could only, or when the administration set up a specific meeting, who knew Zoom could only hold 300 people, and who knew we'd have over 300 people at a Board of Education meeting? Because that's really not our typical. But it was impactful to the community, and they wanted to be on, and so we had to backpedal a little bit. And so, but that's not our standard operating procedure, nor hopefully. I would say more that was a learning lesson for if we hit this situation again, not the standard. So I think often the public has the best of intentions in coming to us, but doesn't always understand our role. It feels like in some ways they want a direct representation role, in that I am talking to you, Patrice, please go run this at the flagpole. And that's not really my understanding of how we work.
No, you're absolutely right, and that does go back to roles and responsibilities. You can certainly make an effort to educate the public on a general basis. My guess is that when an individual member of the community has a specific concern, they're going to forget, just like occasionally some board members forget the roles and responsibilities workshop. That they're in the middle of something that really impacts them, and they know you, and they think you're going to be able to fix it for them. So I would say, if there's an opportunity to have a discussion about the role of the board as a policy-making body and representative of the community, that's great. But you're going to have to continue that one-on-one work of, all right, you're not happy with whatever has happened. If it's going through the process of, have you talked to the principal? Have you talked to the superintendent? Yes, you talked to the superintendent and you didn't like the answer. Well, that's the superintendent, that's their job to make those decisions. If we as a board need to look at our policy, we might reconsider a certain policy that led to the need for that specific decision. But you're not gonna revisit every policy because someone is unhappy. Also remembering that the one person that's unhappy about the current decision, there may be 15 people that think that was perfectly appropriate and that's a good policy. So,
Okay.
does that help?
So one
David.
thing, kind of wrapping a lot of these points up, all good points that I think about too is, and I think, and I don't want to tie everything to the pandemic, but there were some good lessons learned that we need to move forward. But, you know, we struggled where some tough decisions had to be made on the spur of the moment, and the community felt, well, was the board involved? Did the board need to vote? Did the board make a decision? So from a communication standpoint, and we as a group want to continue to support our superintendent day in and day out, you know, through all the challenges. Is there, when I hear about all this communication, is there ever an opportunity to do a joint communication from the superintendent, from the chair?
Absolutely.
Is that stuff that's done in other districts? And is that something that also is it strengthens the voice of the board and the voice of the super to the community? To Tara's point, it educates them on roles and responsibilities, but in a way it says, all right, so the board chair is communicating with the superintendent, so this is this is the direction they're going in.
Absolutely, and that's a great way, particularly on those hot button issues where you want to sort of share the responsibility of, yes, this is the educational professional as well as the elected representatives of the community that support whatever this direction is that we're going in. So
I think we did that
absolutely.
well sometimes too, and I have to give the town credit in the height of, not I have to give the town credit, I would give the town credit, like in the height of the pandemic, the first selectman, the public health director, the superintendent, and at the time as board chair, those were I think some of our best communications kind of as a town saying, here's where we are in the pandemic. And I think it was well received by the public. So I think there's probably opportunities for that again when appropriate, for people signing on saying, look, we've all met, we've talked, we will take it back to our respective boards, but here's where we are. You can't do it every week, I would say,
Right.
or else people don't listen anymore.
Yeah.
But I think those were some pretty helpful, just from a unity standpoint of here's where we are.
Good. Go ahead, Mr.
Yeah,
Mr. Maroney.
just a question on this as well, and I think Tara's point that it's difficult to look at this as the pandemic year and try to make policy on it. But I think that what was frustrating, I think, for many of us was during the pandemic, things were changing daily, and we had meetings, regularly scheduled meetings are twice a month, and then we moved to once a week, and even then it still wasn't fast enough to keep up with the changes. So I think the frustrating part is and again, it's a crisis, but how do you, how much is our responsibility to give to the public, and how much does the public have to go and get the information from our meetings? And to me, that's a conundrum that we struggle with.
Yeah, and I would have to say, first of all, the issues you're raising, particularly with respect to this past year and communicating and decision-making, what are the things that a board should vote on, what are the things that just need to be decided by the superintendent, are issues that every board in the state has struggled with. So that's not unique to your board or your community. I want to talk about the issue of what you need to vote on, because that came up a lot this year. And, there's no point in voting as to whether you're going to follow a governor's executive order, in my opinion. I mean, you can vote, but you still have to follow the governor's executive order, and the administration is not going to violate the law regardless of how the board voted. So that's one thing. The fact that things move so fast in a crisis is exactly why it's important to have a CEO that the board delegates responsibility for making those decisions. We all know that one of the most frustrating things about the past year was we all wanted certainty. We all wanted to know what next week was going to look like. The parents wanted to know. The public bodies wanted to know. Individual citizens wanted to know. But the nature of a crisis, public health or otherwise, is that it is evolving, and the best information from experts changes from Monday to Friday as they learn more about how to deal with the crisis. So I think that helping the community understand that when you've got smart people that have the responsibility of making the best decisions, using this current crisis as the example, public health, town officials, superintendent, that's how the public is going to be best served. And trying to have a board meeting every other day, you're not even going to be able to process the information quickly enough. So while it's frustrating, I think sort of helping the community understand that this is how, in a crisis, decisions need to be made. And it won't always be the body convening to vote.
Mrs. Ritchie.
So I guess what I'm hearing is that when you're in that type of situation, rely on your superintendent as your CEO to be the one communicating, because he has the authority to make these decisions. And maybe at that point in time, it's a good, with the chair circling in, a good time to remind the public that this is how we are structured and this is how we function. And that is a more efficient way, especially when you're in a crisis.
Right.
Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, we had questions from boards that asked us, well, should we vote as to whether the students should be quarantined? Well, of course not. How would you know? How would you have the information that would enable you to make that kind of a decision? But there were members of the community that said, well, how come the administration is deciding that my child's class can't be in school for 2 weeks? Well, because that's an operational decision for safety that isn't subject to board debate about what's a good policy.
So in the interest of time,
Yes.
always good conversations.
I know, but
So
we'll see.
I think that
I'm making notes of possible goals while we're having these conversations that I'm going to try out on you.
Good.
All right, next section. Board operations, and we've really talked an awful lot about that. Two areas where you don't rate yourself as highly as I think you could, in my humble opinion. One is you conduct an effective annual self-evaluation. Hopefully this turns out to be effective, and so you're going to be able to give yourselves high marks in that area. The other is participating in professional development, specifically regarding roles and responsibilities. We've woven that into our conversation this morning. Also remember that we are available, not just myself, but other members of the CABE senior staff. We'll come down and do a roles and responsibilities workshop. Remember that every time you have a new member of the board dynamics change. And so it's important that everyone hear the same thing. We do run a statewide program in December, but following that, we'll go out to individual boards and do roles and responsibilities. So again, you don't have to, it's not a barrier that you can't get over. We try to make it as easy as possible for you. So you're gonna be able to feel like, yeah, we do well in professional development. Yes.
Beyond roles and responsibilities, you all have something of a framework for professional development for board members, don't you?
We have a whole series of workshops. We're doing a lot more as webinars now, and we will continue to do that. We're going to move now to a balance of in-person. For instance, our summer leadership conference will be in person. Our convention will be in person, but just one day in November. But then we're going to continue to offer webinars throughout the year. And again, those are, when we do those, we make them available live, but they're also archived. So respecting the varying schedules of board members and your other responsibilities, you're able to go to those archives and listen. And what I think boards don't take advantage of is some of those, if you identify a webinar, that would be good for the whole board to watch, they're usually 45 or 50 minutes long. You could perhaps start a meeting a little early, and as a board, listen to that together. And that way, and then if it raises issues that you want clarification from the administration as to how do we do this in Darien and how does it apply, that's another way to have professional development. I don't want to choose. David,
Sarah.
you choose.
Thank you. I was just going to say
Sarah.
thank you for doing those webinars. As a new board member, I found those to be incredibly helpful, and there are a couple of us that have been on those regularly, and I would just encourage the rest of you because they are incredibly helpful. So.
Mrs. Ritchie.
I just would like to echo that. I've participated in several, and they are excellent. And just FYI, I didn't know this. I thought I'd have to pay for it, and I think I actually did pay for one, but they're free. So take the time and participate because they are very informative, they are very instructional, and I think very essential to doing our job. Thanks.
Thank you.
Great. Board ethics. I think the one thing that I would point out here is, well, that there was some divergent viewpoints around dealing with internal and external conflicts openly, honestly, and respectfully. Civility is something that it is key. We actually, at CABE and at the National School Boards Association, we brought the issue to them. And we have a resolution calling on public officials at all levels of government to conduct themselves with civility, because the public is watching, the students are watching, and learning how to respectfully disagree with people and address what could be divisive issues in a productive manner are skills that we perhaps haven't developed as fully as we need to. I would say that I think many of our students are actually great role models for the public in terms of how they are able to have some of those conversations and represent their viewpoints. Yeah. The other issue related to ethics that came up was if there are discussions that happen outside of the board meeting and what that might look like. And my only observation is that perception is very important. So to the extent that a meeting adjourns and then a couple of groups of people, maybe a quorum, maybe slightly less, continue to have a conversation about board business, not about what their vacation plans are or whatever else, that certainly creates the perception that business is still going on. And we used to have boards in Connecticut that ended their board meetings and then went out for coffee together. And we said, we love the fact that you want to spend time with each other, but you're creating a really, and this was in a small town, so word quickly spread that the board meeting continued at the coffee shop. Not a good optic, and better to have sort of a clean break, and just my best advice on that. The final area is the board superintendent team, and generally you as a board gave that consistently high marks. So that's another thing to celebrate, to recognize the importance of that. When boards and their superintendents are not working collaboratively, a whole lot of energy that could be spent on moving the district forward, supporting student achievement, supporting student social emotional needs, gets diverted, and that's unfortunate, and it's to the detriment of those districts. So celebrate the fact that you've got a good team and work hard to maintain that team, because it doesn't just happen magically, unfortunately. Those are my main comments. Other comments that arose for you out of the self-evaluation?
I just want to go back a little bit to the code of ethics. I don't know that I've ever seen a board code of ethics, and we don't have one. Is that something that we could think about putting together, that is, the public knows how we're going to act, if we're going, I mean, you know, what are we held to? What standards are we held to? I don't know how other people feel about that, but I would be more than happy to have one of those.
I can certainly send you some models that other districts have used. Normally, a board will adopt it as a policy item. So if you'd like, I'm happy to make a couple of examples available.
So we had it at one point.
We did.
Yeah.
I don't know if you haven't seen it where it's gotten to. I will do a little research, but it exists.
Yeah.
I've not seen that.
Yeah, it exists. But that's a problem. Like if we can't find it, that's a problem.
We had something back in like 16, 17, and I think we replaced it with a description of our roles and responsibilities and didn't go back to the ethics piece of it.
So we had a code of ethics. I think you created a document, roles and responsibilities. Did we do a full replacement of that code of ethics?
We did, and we never went back to the ethics piece and replaced that.
Okay, so we have Jill's roles and responsibilities, which we all agreed to, but we will,
Yeah, I think
there is a document that exists, and we will pull it up, and I will get it to Duke.
You might want to re-adopt it, for example.
Yeah,
And-
I
and-
think it might have
Send us
been
some of your
replaced.
examples.
I think, Jill, right? Am I remembering right? That's where, at least where I should look time-wise.
Oh, yes, in that year. Before that year.
Because I
but
think you
it was on the
wanted roles and
website.
responsibilities.
So I
Is
got
that-
it there.
Any other questions or board comments about the sections that we just went through?
Mr. Chairman?
Yes.
Only because you're here, and I haven't, well, I actually should have clarified, I didn't have access to the board's comments either, and I shouldn't, so. But a discussion we might be having shortly is the potential of students sitting as board representatives. Just independently, I'm curious as to what you would think of that, or what, I don't know if the board has questions of you about that or not, but since you're here, I'll just ask you.
Absolutely. More and more boards are having student representatives. Again, you'd probably adopt a policy that sets out, the process, a policy or regulation in terms of how they're going to be selected. Normally that's done at the high school level. The board is not actually involved in selecting. The one thing I would strongly encourage you to do is to make good use of student representatives if you have them. I have been to boards where students are asked to give a report. They report on the activities at the high school, that there was a blood drive, that the upcoming football game, just very specific activities. And then the board chair will say, well, we know you probably have a lot of homework to do. Please feel free to leave. And so those board members are never part of the discussion of the policy issues. And I would say that as important as getting one's homework done, time management is, if you assume the responsibility of serving on a board, except in extraordinary circumstances or when the board meeting goes past 10 p.m., I would expect a student representative to be at the table. So the other side of that is, I have seen boards where the student rep is very much, rep or reps, very much part of the discussion. Their opinions are solicited. If you ever watch meetings of the State Board of Education in the non-pandemic years, they have 2 student reps who are very much engaged, very much embraced by the board for their perspective. So use student voice. Don't just have them come and give you a report, which you could, they could email you a paragraph.
Joe?
This is on another topic, though, if we're done with this one.
Can I ask a quick follow-up
Yeah.
on that? So do you think best practices, they come to every single meeting? Because when you think about having, because I think Dr. Adley is thinking about a junior and a senior, correct? Junior year is a
Junior,
right?
senior, yeah.
Stressful year. Our budget meetings are long. It's multiple nights going to RTM. all of those things, or do you just foresee them coming to our every other, twice a monthly meeting?
Yes,
So
yeah,
not the budget process, not,
Right, I mean, they
unless
should
they
be,
want.
that's right. They should be welcome at anything, but I think the expectation would be that they attend the regular meetings of the board.
Thank you.
And again, with respect to, you know, if you're going on in a lengthy discussion and it's after 10 PM, I think that's the appropriate point for a board chair to say, we realize it's late and you've got to get up early in the morning.
All meetings.
Yes,
Or like
but-
we all
9:30.
know too.
But this notion of, you know, just give your report and why don't you leave,
Yeah.
I find, and I'll tell you, a lot of boards do that. So,
So it's almost lip service to doing the process without
Exactly.
without
So-
getting the input and the value of it.
right,
Yeah.
right, and these are really articulate
Oh, yeah.
young people.
Well, when they present to us on their summer internships and different programs like that, I mean, they have a lot to say and a lot of good stuff to say. And
Yeah.
It'll add value. It'll be a great opportunity.
Okay.
Good. Jill?
Early on, you mentioned that when we were under vision, you were going to talk a little bit more about aligning goals with the strategic plan. Did you want to, was there something you wanted to circle back on?
Not specifically, I would just say that, can I transition
Yes.
to talking about
That's
goals?
what I was gonna say. Do you wanna
So
move
I'm
to
gonna
the
put a
next? Yeah.
couple of things out there that
Sure.
I've heard that sort of resonated with me that may be goals that you want to consider.
Great.
And in terms of process, generally what boards do is have this discussion at their retreat about what the board goals are for the next year, and then at a subsequent board meeting, actually adopt the goals. So again, you've got those in front of you, they're what the board has committed to, and then in 6 months, you revisit them, not in an elaborate process, but just say, well, let's check in, let's look back at our goals and see how we're doing. So, to that, your goals as a board your overarching goal should be to support the strategic plan that you've just adopted. Now, the question is, what does that actually look like? So I've heard a couple of things today and looking at your evaluations. One is helping engaging with the community to build their understanding of the role of the Board of Ed. To communicate, to enhance communications with the community, from the board and administration, and we had talked specifically about that being the superintendent and the board chair, again, strategically, not every week. You had some discussion around the code of ethics, and do you want that to be a board goal to
Review.
revisit, re-adopt?
Yes.
Makes sense.
Yes.
And I'll throw this one out to increase your engagement in professional development. And I'm going to stop there. Those are the things that struck me as sort of specific deliverables as a board that would, when you look at those collectively and you think about your strategic plan, if the board, you're already a well-functioning board. Trust me, we've been at boards where they throw things at each other, so you may think we have a low bar for.
Let's not get there. Maybe. Let's stay out of the bar.
It's only Tuesday. So when you're having a bad day, think about that, okay? But when you continue to improve your work as a board, that goes into supporting the overall strategic plan from my perspective.
Thank you for those. Early on, you talked a little bit about policy and incorporating that more effectively. Is that something that, because there was even some question like earlier, what's the role of policy in, how prescriptive do we get in policy versus at what level do we leave it, and what's that cycle look like in terms of how it informs our discussions? Was there a goal you would see there?
That may fall more into operational, I think, as the board agenda is prepared. It might be something to think about rather than, the board needing to work on that per se. Okay. And there is that distinction between what should be in policy and regulation, because regulation is the very operational, the nuts and bolts. Policy review is absolutely important. It's a huge task. I mean, just keeping up in Mastaro, I have in my briefcase, it's not his fault, don't blame him, it's the legislature. Do you know that the implementer bill is 837 pages long?
Yep.
So, and there are more sections requiring changes to board policy than I have ever seen. And I've been doing this over 30 years. So, it's just keeping up with what has to be modified is one challenge. Some boards approach the policy review process as, all right, we're going to take, one section, we're going to take the 3000 series and we're going to work on that this year. That needs to be done for a subcommittee, I would advise, because a whole board, and then you want to make sure that the board trusts the work of the subcommittee so that you don't have to redo all of that work at a full board meeting, because that's what bogs boards down and they never get done reviewing policy.
But I would say I like the idea, maybe for us to think about and consider in our next discussion, of attaching the policy to the agenda item. I think that'll keep us out of operations, because sometimes you slip into operations without even meaning to, right? The operations sometimes is a little more interesting.
I was just going to say that.
I like policy, but some people really, but maybe that's a good way to kind of keep the conversation at the policy level, just even as a reminder, because I think we can all fall victim to that, and it would be helpful. I mean, Katie and I kind of know this policy book intimately because we're really boring and have read it for so many years, but I think it would help everyone, even new board members coming on, know to reference back to policy.
I also think it'll help us highlight areas where maybe we do need to review that policy.
Yeah.
If it's that, we'll just keep all of our eyes on
Yeah.
March. We're working on an overhaul this summer of our policy. Half is online, some is still in an old book. So it's a work in progress, and it's a big undertaking.
And it might help you guys with the agendas, or whomever, is forming, because you'll at least start to recognize when there's not a policy tie-in, and that could happen, but then you've made an active decision to put it on for board discussion, even though there's not a policy attached.
I think those are two good points. And Patrice, my experience of districts that do this, at first I think they're fewer. They're much fewer in number that actually align it to the policies. But in doing that, it will be a work in progress that we'll just have to sort of. There's actually software to do this and different things, but the actual tie into the policy and stuff, it'll just be a work in progress for us. At the start, it's just, can we get it actually working and up and running, and then the value of it then will proceed after that.
So is it the kind of thing where if we get everything online, we could just have the link to the actual policy versus a reference?
You don't post the actual policy, but you could. It's a link's a link, right? A link's a link, yep.
And people could read it,
Right.
Yeah.
That would be ideal if we could get
That's where you want to get to, yes.
Yeah. Goals.
Go ahead, Jill.
Technical question. So one of the things I noticed in the CABE policy manual is that, in order to keep sort of that distance between things that might be more at the policy level and things that might be regulatory, you using, like when you have an MOU, you're using a bylaw structure. What do you do for something like email or social media or an MOU where it maybe doesn't rise to the level of policy because you want to keep your policy more at a higher level. But, if you're thinking about like onboarding a new board member, how do you explain how to use email, or how do you explain what social media is, or how do you walk through an MOU? Are you using two different structures? Do you have a recommendation? Do you know what I mean?
I'm not exactly sure I understand the question. Let me try, and you can tell me if I don't hit it. The policy, for instance, would talk about, in general, use of email. But then there's also FOI implications. So if you're onboarding a new board member, it's a combination of, all right, here's our district policy that governs this issue. Here's a discussion about what the legal requirements are to make sure we comply with FOI. So does that, I'm not sure about the question about structure.
Well, I'm just thinking about longevity and passing on information, and I know it changes, so you don't want to, make things too much written in stone. But I think it particularly comes up when we think about onboarding, which is why I'm starting there. So if you start with something like email, where you wouldn't want to write all of this into policy, and where you would want, you don't necessarily need to document FOIA, you may or may not, but in your policy.
Right.
But you need to make sure that there is some referenceable way to encapsulate something complex like email, and that people can refer back to, because it takes time to you can't sit in one meeting and understand exactly how it works.
Yeah, and I just think that's something that is part of a discussion when you're onboarding someone, and there are reference materials. I mean, there's a booklet about FOI that discusses specifically email communications. So I think that's how I would approach it.
Okay, thank you.
Anything else on your end, Patrice, around? Anything else on your end?
No, are there other issues that you want to identify as goals based on thoughts that you have?
Well, I would open it up to the board. I mean, we all did the self-evaluation. We've had great feedback from Patrice, but amongst ourselves, is there anything we want to, from a self-evaluation standpoint, put on the table for discussion? And I'll back that up, Patrice, by saying, there's no one on this board that's shy. There's no one in our public that's shy, and all our partners that we work with, from CDSP to the PTOs. But I also look back on the year and think of what we accomplished in that. We kept schools in person for as much as we could. We executed on hybrid, on remote, with all the challenges associated with it. We put a shovel in the ground and we're building a new elementary school. We moved forward a long overdue plan to remove portables and do renovations on 3 schools that's moving through the process right now. We moved through the strategic plan. We had a presentation around the vision of the graduate recently. We had an update and a presentation on the IDEA program. So I don't know, when I step back and I look at the year, I think we accomplished a lot. I worry about how much we have on our plate and executing quality versus quantity. And we always go back to Dr. Adley and his incredible team, what other resources they need to continue to do this. But I do think about balancing sometimes, because all of that is on top of a day job of educating our students. And I think a couple of people here on the board said it, if we always true up to our job is how do we educate the students and how do we focus on the students, but if you layer all that on top of that, and that's stuff that it doesn't necessarily get done during the 9 to 5 working hours. So I throw it out to the board if there's anything else you want to, talk about or discuss in terms of how we operate. I have a section here on some board operations and process, which is just kind of operational stuff in terms of meetings and times and committees. But while we have you here, is there anything else we want to discuss as a board? Mr. Cini.
I watched one of the presentations, the board's role in the budget process, which was spectacular. I think it was the town administrator from Vernon and
Yes.
Ellington. I couldn't keep track of who was who.
He's on the board, he was on the board in Ellington, and he is the town administrator in Vernon.
And you know, the topic of collaboration and how closely we work with the town side officials. And there are some, if you haven't seen this one, guys, it's really cool because certain towns have taken collaboration to the next level. You know, if there's, but via previous comments around here, there is a divide amongst some of us how closely we should be working with the appropriation bodies and other bodies in town. So I don't know if you have any thoughts to share around that.
I think my general observation is that collaboration is very important. Having those conversations around, for instance, shared services is very important. That doesn't mean that everything is appropriate for that type of sharing. There are communities that have tried to have the public works department do the mowing of the school lawns and the plowing of the driveways. And in some cases it's worked beautifully, and in other cases it's become such a low priority for the town that the board has said, we can't have the grass, you know, knee high on our little kids, so, you know, we're taking it back. So having the conversation so that you develop relationships, build trust, and again, that's generally at the administrative level, is very important. When it comes to fiscal issues, there will always be a tension. I began my career working for the Connecticut Conference of Municipalities, so I've worked with municipal officials as well. There will always be a tension between the board budget and the town budget. In most communities, the board budget is the largest part of the overall town budget. I go back to, while you want collaboration and you want communication, you are the body that advocates for the educational needs of the community. So it is very appropriate, and you should not be shy about advocating for those needs, even understanding that there might not be agreement by the municipal officials that a certain percentage increase is needed. And that's just, you have different roles. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you.
Anything else? No? Good. Any parting comments? Patrice?
I would encourage you to take that summary that you gave of how much has been accomplished this year and send that out as some sort of communication. Because again, when I think newsletter, unless you already have one, I am really cautious about creating new projects. So maybe doesn't have to be something that,
Right.
an end of the year communication.
We used to have a newsletter where quarterly the board chair would write,
Yeah,
this is
that's
what
right.
happened.
Yeah, and someone
wanna
in the
lose-
administration had to format it.
Yes.
And, yeah.
And
yeah.
so we have enjoyed the benefit of multiple administrations, and are very happy to have our current one. But that was one of the methods that we used before. Maybe there's a new one, but I do think quarterly that used to give people that this is what the board's
I
accomplished.
think it's a
Even an end of the year summary after
Yeah.
this extraordinary year, it doesn't mean you have to institutionalize it and do it forever. But the way you communicated that about, you know, it's important to think back on all we've accomplished. That's not tooting your own horn. That is simply the reality of what the board and the administration, your teachers, the school community accomplished this year. So, congratulations.
Thank you. Team effort.
Patrice, sorry, Mr. Chairman. No, I just want to thank you, Patrice, for coming and facilitating, and to the board members for your reflection, your preparation before today, and also
Yes.
your reflection today. It's professional development too, and it's very helpful to the process. So, and I appreciate it because it's also part of the whole team process we committed to. So, thank you.
Thank you, and
Thanks for coming.
have a good rest of the day, and I hope you get to enjoy some fun times this summer.
Thank you, Patrice.
Thank you, Patrice.
Thanks.
Okay, is Is there any place, can I go grab a cup of water? I'm
Yes, if we want to
highly
take a,
overcaffeinated.
we're a little ahead of schedule, so if we want to take a quick coffee break.
You don't even have to stop, I'm just.
Yep, okay. Take a,
Oh, you're welcome.
I need to fill my tea. Michelle, there was no Jeff, can you hear me? Is that clearer? You're good. All right, good. So thank you for all of our friends out there on Zoom land for allowing us a little coffee tea break. So we'll move on to board operations and process. This may be a short conversation, maybe a little longer conversation. I think over the course of the time that I've been on the board, over the course of the last couple of months, people have had comments about the time of our board meetings, the length of our board meetings, committee structures, different processes around approval with the personal action report, and then Alan touched base with student representatives for the Board of Education. So I'll start at my end comment there. Alan, is there anything you wanted to add? I think the board, you mentioned it a while ago, and the board supports and would love to see moving forward with the student representatives on the board for the back to school season. Is there anything you wanted to add?
No, no, other than...
Nice document you put together, thank you.
Is this on now or no?
You had it.
Do we have it?
Yes.
Now you're on.
Is that good? Okay. No, other than it sort of adds to what was mentioned today about celebrating and profiling our children, our students. So this is a nice opportunity. It also builds nicely into our mission and vision. What I have suggested or just outlined is simply that, right? It's just simply, this is one way that it can work. I'm pretty familiar with this way, and I feel as if it does work pretty well. So the idea that the high school can select someone, that has to be all delineated up front. Eventually, anything, if the board is so inclined to still continue with this idea, it would have to be put in policy, so everything would have to be delineated. The only reason for a senior and junior, from my perspective, it has proven out to provide some nice continuity, and it's just nice continuity. I do feel that the students, particularly in our district, will have an awful lot to contribute to discussions, serious discussions. So I'm in favour of it. I have been in favour of it. I've just put a wee bit of colour to it here to how it might work. It does. Some other districts just have kids come and report out and then leave. That to me is not really a full participating board member. There would not be an executive session material, executive session scenarios, personnel scenarios. They wouldn't be on committees. That's just way too much and way unnecessary. I'm not going to go through all this. I think you've read it, and if you have any questions for me, I'm happy to.
So any questions around that, the process, or I like that Patrice presented, some come and give a report. I would like participation. I would like some sense of a report. Maybe we can decide on what we'd like to hear about or hear from them, but I'll open it up. Katie.
A couple of things. First, the students that were selected, and we've said this before, for the strategic plan, Jackson and Olivia, were phenomenal.
Phenomenal.
So I absolutely trust that they will find us similar candidates. They really were part of the discussion. The one question I have is there a way that part of their charge is to also report back on the other school levels? You don't want it to be all high school related, so if they are doing updates, maybe they interface with student council reps at the elementaries or middle, so it's more of a, if there is like an update that they're giving, that they include those schools as well.
I very much appreciate that suggestion, and in any of the districts that I'm aware of, that's been the hardest part to do.
It's hard, yeah.
Understandably,
Yeah.
but I do think it's admirable, and it should be part of the task. Set up a system, some way of
Yeah.
of
Just figure it
articulating
out,
that.
or they
Yep,
could
yep.
figure it out.
I think it'd be a great
Yeah.
opportunity for
charge.
some of the fifth graders in these elementary
Yeah.
schools and their little councils to
Yeah.
kind of pull together the
Yeah.
local school neighborhood feel. Good. Mr. Sini.
Are there any unintended consequences, like it was mentioned earlier, keeping kids out too late, or is there a way to manage that, or in your experience, is it something we should worry about?
I think it's definitely something to be conscious of. Some of our meetings are significantly long. It's nearly unrealistic to think that some of our students, particularly as they get down the stretch, can stay that late and can manage that much. But I've found that the children themselves, the students, actually articulate that themselves, and they're comfortable enough doing that. And as long as we are comfortable enough setting that scene, I mean, I don't think it'll happen, but invariably, if someone doesn't show and is not a part of the board regularly, they shouldn't really be part of it, right?
Yeah.
So that type of stuff just has to be, you have to be conscious about that. You've just increased the board to another two participants, right? So just sort of magnifies conversations, and so length is in that capacity if you're talking about unintended consequences.
So they would get the board package, so they would see what's on it, could balance their schedule in terms of when they would want to leave, and I would say they would be more first on an agenda to give an update.
Well, typically they're
earlier.
right up front in terms
Yeah.
of their,
Good.
and we can make that relatively concise so that they stay for the major content of it. But
Yep.
I was
Vice
just
Parent.
I was just going to echo what Katie said. The addition of those two students to the strategic planning committee was by far the best part of that process. So I think this could be very, very successful. And I also think, to the point of the unintended consequences, having two of them, you know, if it's going to be a long meeting and one has 3 exams the next day, well, then that person doesn't need to go, right? So that you have 2 students that can rotate in and out if there is a need. I think that model will work well.
Good. Mrs. Ritchie.
I don't know if it's applicable, but the town charter establishes that we have 9 Board of Ed members, so I would just, I guess, question, is there a need to look at that and revisit it if we're adding, I don't know if it's technically adding 2 members, but we are adding 2 people essentially. So it's just a question that just popped into my mind, just to think about.
Yeah.
yeah,
Representatives. It's the key word, representative.
Uh,
Mr. Dr. Adams, are you envisioning then when you say junior and senior, when these kids sign up or put their name in to be considered, that they are signing up for a 2-year role?
well, essentially, apart from the first year where the senior will transition out,
Yeah.
yes, that would be the. That
Okay,
would
so
be
that'll
the
be clear to them. It's not just a junior and senior. If you apply your junior year, you're really looking
2
for
years.
both years.
Correct. Yes. And actually, I mean, that's an interesting point, but there are no sort of legal references to student representatives or other or things of that nature.
Mrs. McCammon.
So, one of the things that I enjoyed, I agree with the comments on the strategic planning students that were there, and then the students who participated in the library reimagining were also very effective, but they were very different than the students who were at the strategic planning. So I think it's exciting that, you know, there's an opportunity for the students who like this kind of work or might be inclined to this particular kind of work to participate in this process. I do think the one rub, and that we certainly feel it as board members, is that there is a public aspect to these board meetings. And so I do think that the process for if there were to be any reason for a student to need to be removed, that it be very, very clear out front, because it could happen, and that would be tough for a student to live that publicly.
Yes, and that could be an unintended, hopefully not necessary outcome, but those things have to be explained in the orientation and on the onboarding between the board chair, myself, and the representatives.
Mr. Brown.
Thanks. I just was going to, try to evaluate this. My question is, there are 9 of us. We're going to add 2. The way people work, the dynamics of the 9 members is complicated, and I just don't know that the trade-off from having the point of view from a couple of students is really worth disrupting the way people interact right now as a board, and I'm not sure where that value is. I can see where the value of having interesting perspectives is appealing, but I just, weighing the 2, I don't see how this tips the scale.
So they're, just to clarify, I don't know if you mean this or not, they're non-voting members, so it's not going to influence it.
Right, but obviously conversations, the
Yes.
interplay, how things go back and forth, all that's going to change in the meeting dynamics
Yes.
and the length potentially of topics.
I would suggest it might improve and help and be useful, but that's just my perspective.
Yeah, I would just, picking up of Katie, Sarah, and Jill's comments on the vision of the graduate, the student perspective was incredibly useful, and the student managed to handle themselves well. Variety of different staff, parents who knew each other, did administrators. I do think both their perspective and their presence can sometimes elevate the conversation, which is of value. So we've seen it on Libraries Reimagined, we've seen it on strategic planning. Dennis, you can jump in, but I saw it on Vision of Graduate. I think it actually can be, I hear your point, and I know what you're saying, Mr. Brown. I actually think it can be very helpful, would just be my counterpoint.
Thank you, Mrs. Ackman. Mr. Sini.
And then is it the administration's decision on a policy for selection, or how's that going to work as one? And then I would just, it might be obvious, but bar existing board members' children from participating.
That's a good point. That's a good point.
It's a good point, yeah. So the high school typically would come up with its process of how to do that, either through student government or otherwise, right? Now, whether the board, and I said in the memorandum, maybe the board, excuse me, would like to know that in advance, which is fine, or approve the whole process. I think that's fine.
That'd be great.
So we can articulate it through that particular process, but they certainly know the type of thing that's going to work the best, and certainly have the suggestions around that. But
That could just be great to be informed before we vote on it.
Yeah, I think as they develop the process, I think it would be good to see it and add our 2 cents as we look it over. Yeah, Mr. Maroney.
And just to echo Mrs. Ockman, I mean, the student reps were outstanding, and I think going to a future topic on this point, I think the student representatives can help us with our agenda, because you'll have to, from my view, is we put the elements where we want the students' input first, and then maybe if they have to leave early, then some of the later things will happen after they've left. And I think we will also have to abide by their time, that, you know, we realize that they're going to have to be, we will value their opinion, I think, and we'll want to, you know, make sure the meetings are shorter and curtailed so they can participate.
the other unintended consequences, I'm not sure what the configuration of this room's going to be, but we'll work it out.
We'll have to push back the wall once we move the copy center.
There you go.
More space. So, good. All right, so you'll, go ahead.
So I'm reading the board that to proceed with this, but I think we would have to put it all in policy first of all. Right? We don't need to expedite this, but do it thoughtfully. Bring back a policy that actually explains what we're doing. But the tenets of this is a sort of the idea that I hear the board sort of.
I think a
go in that
consensus
direction.
from the board to move forward, develop the policy, the process, report that back to us. I would like to understand a timeline as your goal. They start at September, the second meeting in September, the first meeting in October. I don't know.
I think I'll
Next
sort
year.
of consult a little bit with the high school.
Next year.
With the high school.
Okay.
First of all, just to make sure that the processes that I have to know their process first of all, how long that's going to take.
Can I
Because
just
I mean,
be,
to the point of some of the members here, I mean, we dive back into September in a pretty busy mode, and we dive into the budget season, and, you know,
Sure.
a lot goes on. So let's think through that process. Mrs. Ockman.
can I just echo, I think what Mr. Sini is saying, I think the board wants to make sure we see and have a voice in the selection process, because these are going to be representatives. So if the high school maybe could devise it, you know, they've done selection process before, but we've all lived that. So, and given that they're going to be reps on our board, I think that process needs to come back to us. Mrs. McCammon brings up a really good point that, like, we are a little more public, and so we need to be thoughtful that there are children involved.
Is there an opportunity which is good training or experience for them, for us to organize a small interview committee and have them go through that type of process?
I would leave it to my own personal thoughts. I would leave it to the administration to design a process. I just don't want to get a policy back saying we want student reps and then not know the process. Because I
Oh, I'll
think, like
definitely
we've seen with
articulate
captainships or this, we've lived it, and we might be able to say, hey, you need to think about the kids who X, or you might know that it affects a kid when Y happens. And
Right.
so,
That's the intent. Yep.
yeah,
Agree,
just
agree.
bring it.
agree,
I think
agree.
that's what you're saying, Mr. Sini, correct?
Yep.
Okay.
So,
Great. Good. Thank you. Good. Other points I had, and again, no decisions, just conversation. I think the message is clear. I think on agenda items, I think Dr. Adley and I will continue to work hard. I think some meetings just go on longer than others based on what's on the agenda. You know, my goal would be a 2-hour meeting is a good meeting in terms of people's attention span late at night after a long day of working. So that would be my thoughts. Also, as I've said to Dr. Adley, if need be, we should look at certain agenda items and have an additional meeting to focus on that particular topic for an hour or an hour and a half, and not push ourselves to 11, 11:30, or 12 o'clock at night. So we'll continue to stay focused on the agenda. I think also some feedback I've heard, you know, the administration, the cabinet level members do a great job on presentations. I think we want the presentations to continue to be kind of very specific and to the point, and I think we'll we'll take the responsibility that we've reviewed the presentations and we're ready with our questions. So we can think about how much of the presentation we want presented, which I think will help with the process, and the materials go out. But I don't want to take away from people wanting to understand the information and ask all the appropriate questions. But let's think about how we continue to streamline, but never getting away from making sure everyone feels comfortable with all the information. So I'll pause there for a moment. Mrs. Parent.
I just want to say we have to be cognizant to what the public sees, right? So if we see an entire presentation and only ask questions, so there has to be some sort of presentation of something. But,
No, absolutely. Thank you. With that said, over time I've gotten comments about meeting start time. Again, just a discussion. We start at 7:30. Quite often we do executive session at 7, lately 6:30. So if we were to move our meetings back to 7, that would also move executive sessions earlier if we had them. That involves commuting, sports, and everything like that. So is there any interest in a discussion around that, Mr. Cini?
So as a former and future commuter, with slowing train times, 7 o'clock works, in my humble opinion. I know, Dennis, you might want to weigh in. I think 7 o'clock is a time frame which other town bodies use. I would just ask, if we do 7, that why don't we can start executive session at 7 and then just push the regular meeting time out. And if we notice it correctly, so have a consistent start time of the Board of Education meetings, whether or not they're exec sessions or.
But that might be inconsistent, John, for the public.
I mean, if you notice it that we have exec session at, I get your question, but 6:36 gets real tough as a future commuter.
Yeah.
Right.
Agreed on that.
Mrs. Ritchie?
A 6 o'clock start time. I don't have a commute, but I have someone that commutes, and I need them to commute home to help me with the other stuff going on. So a 6 o'clock start time is probably really difficult for me. So I think that we just need to make sure that when we've got a longer exec session, that we're factoring in that people need to get from point A to point B.
Mr. Brown?
As a former and current hybrid commuter, I would echo Mr. Cini's comments for 7 o'clock. I think I've seen this in the past where we've had 7 be exec and then 7:30 be the full, so I'd be fine with that. The only wrinkle is I would encourage that we keep the Zoom option or other teleconference option open to board members as situations change, not just commuters, but other people who are here and have other obligations.
Yep. Excuse me, Mrs. Achman.
I think we just have to be cognizant of why we're making the decision. And there's, at this point, kind of a long established history. Kind of Board of Education meetings start at 7:30, and special meetings are warned usually for 7 p.m. It's kind of the expectation. So if the board chooses to make a change, I think we have to be clear about that, about the why, and really inform everyone. Yes, I know notices go out, and it will be perfectly legal to warn our meetings at the times that we choose to warn our meetings. We do have a long tradition, and so I think we have to make sure we know the why of changing. That's all.
Yeah, no, understood. And I've gotten comments from public and parents too on start time of meetings. So that's why I wanted to have the discussions. I think other town bodies have tried to change meeting times, and sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't work. And again, it's all about the communication and how we get it out there. Mrs. Ritchie?
So I guess that asks the question, why? Why are people thinking we need an earlier start time? Is it because our meetings run so late?
I think that's part of the feedback I've gotten. People
trying to get home before midnight and go to bed? Okay.
Yeah, and I think some of it is people just don't, although many of our members do, thank them. People would prefer an earlier start time and an earlier end time. I think people over the last year have adjusted their schedules. They're home, they're available at 7. So that's how a lot of this has come up.
And it's
Mrs. Stein?
also, we have presenters and administrators here who have the gap in their day, extra hours. To me, the earlier the better, but I don't work, so I respect the commuters.
Thank you for bringing that up, Mrs. Stein. That's a big part of it too. We've got, during the budget season and during meetings with other, town bodies, you've got a whole cabinet here till 7 o'clock or 7 o'clock at night. And so it's a balancing of time, is really what it is. So.
And it's a half hour we're talking about, basically.
Yeah. But I do agree.
What time did you do it in your former district?
Sorry, go ahead,
What
Mrs.
time were your meetings?
7.
7, and so good point, thank you, Mrs. Stein. How did you do executive session? 6:30?
Sometimes executive session was after the meeting. More often than not, it was after the meeting.
Yeah, that's not unusual.
Okay.
And one of the reasons we did it one of the reasons we always did 7:30 is because we did our exec sessions before, and it was hard for commuters to get home.
Yeah, well, because
Prior.
some executive sessions now have been bumping up to 6:30, and that sometimes
Yeah.
hasn't given us enough time at the
Yeah.
end of the day. Mr. Brown?
I'm not sure I want to ask this, but I was going to ask Alan, what time did you guys finish up if you started at 7 for the most part?
I'll have to say it just depends. It just
Eight,
depends.
8:15, 8:30?
No, it wasn't. I mean, I guess
normal year, we can
the general finish time is probably by 10 o'clock.
So 3-hour meeting?
Yeah.
Again,
So I
it
think
depends.
that
Yeah,
I
it
think it's all
depends.
dep- because it all depends on the conversation.
Depends on agenda.
Right? Like,
Yeah. Yep.
But aren't we hopeful that, I mean, a lot of our meetings, the actual meat of our meetings this year didn't start till 45 minutes to an hour later because of COVID updates. Like, hopefully, in the fall, we'll be able to just get right into our agenda.
It's a really good point, too. Mr. Maroney?
I think the other part, as a commuter, is the train schedules are
Bad.
infrequent at the best, and
Yeah.
I'm looking now, I mean, the time is, so if we'd scheduled at 6:30, there's a 5:02, gets in at 6, 5:15, 6:13, and then there's a 6:02, 7. So,
Yeah.
where do you schedule the meeting? Because there's not a train every 15 minutes or 20 minutes. So it's difficult for us as commuters to figure out what train to catch. I mean, the RTM used to have the meeting start at 8:15 because there was a train that came in at 8:03 and we were able to get there by 8:15. So I don't know that we should go so far to schedule our meetings around the commuting time, but
Right, but
I'm
it's something to
struggling
consider.
with how to get, it
Yeah.
would be difficult for me to leave at 4 to get home at 5 to be
Yes.
here at a 6 o'clock meeting to,
Understood. Yeah, Mr. Brown?
I mean, I hear what you're saying, Dennis, but I think that's why I was thinking about the Zoom.
Mm-hmm.
If somebody's zooming in for the first 15 minutes, I don't know that that's so bad. And so, I mean, we've certainly become used to working that way, and I think maybe we should use that to our advantage. And that could be just a train schedule, or something could happen where, a pickup doesn't happen, or sports runs late, and, but I think, that, there's a very good point about the admin and keeping them sitting around waiting for us, and keeping them till 11 if we can avoid it.
Is there any further discussion on the executive session piece after the meeting? I mean, that's interesting.
It's an interesting idea.
It doesn't involve the cabinet, or does it? Not necessarily, if they need to be. I'm just leery of their time commitment too, but if you think about it, executive session at 6:30, or 7, it's really our time, it's not the public time, so that's something to think about too.
I love the.
And if we're committing to try and have an efficient meeting, which I think Mrs. Stein brings up a good point as we go forward, COVID updates will be less, we're back to kind of a normal business schedule, then the agenda can tighten up around a 2-hour plus meeting, depending on the conversation, and maybe executive session after. And we don't always have executive session, so, Mrs. Parent.
It's just the only issue I see with doing it after, like, there have been times this year where we've discussed something in executive session, and then it's been on the
That's a good
regular
point.
agenda,
Yep.
so depending.
But you can always move the executive session
Yes.
to before the
Yeah.
meeting if the administration is looking us to vote on something from a personnel standpoint. All right, so why don't we continue to mull it over a little bit, and I'll bring it back up as an agenda item. I'll get some feedback from everyone and see if there's any kind of change we want to do there.
What time are we starting the July meeting next week?
Nothing is changing.
Nothing's changing.
Nothing's
Okay.
changing.
Okay, all right, okay.
Nothing is changing. There's no vote, there's nothing changing. Public comment process, I don't know, that's come up over the years. We take public comment in, what do we do with public comment? What do we want to do with public comment? I would ask Dr. Adley, is there anything you did differently in your previous life, or anything you would recommend around public comment? I think it's valuable. I mean, our friends out there in Zoom land or in person bring up valuable points. A lot of times I think we cover the questions through our normal meetings or through follow-up that the administration does, but is there anything we should be looking at or doing differently around public comment?
Well, I think one of the questions that the board brought up was, do we respond to everybody in that capacity? So I'm used to responding to everybody, but I'm also understanding this, like, you've got a tsunami of people who will show up in terms of, so that can, like, be very, very cumbersome, so I'm very cautious about that. Certainly recognizing that they participated or recognize that they sent an email, I think is appropriate, and that the board culturally is understanding we're listening to what we've read what you sent us, we're listening to your comments. Inherently, we're taking those into consideration, and some recognition that they sent it. But beyond that, I'm not so sure practically we could physically get back to everybody who comments with a response back to the some of them are very detailed, and there are just many of them. It tends to be, and this year probably highlighted it, but
Right.
that would be my concern, obviously.
Well, I think acknowledging, I think our public knows that we listen to them, and we acknowledge the written correspondent, and it's used as we go through the
Right.
process of developing some of the information or answering the questions. So I'll open it up to any board comments or questions. Mrs. Achman?
So I would say that there's, from what I'm hearing you say, I don't know if we're talking about two different things. Public comment, by definition, is received by the Board of Education. This year, I think a lot of what has happened is the administration has received communication at board meetings. So whether you choose to respond to that, but I mean, maybe that's part of educating the public on our job, because sometimes people are really coming on talking to the superintendent and the administration at our board meetings, which is fine because it's a venue, but by definition, we receive public comment. So if someone's emailing you, Dr. Adley, I think we, as a board, kind of expect you to get back to them.
Yes.
If it's happening at public comment, I think we have discussed at the board table kind of what that is. I think we've been advised by our attorneys what that is. I think CABE has advised us what that is. So we would really be making a shift in that.
Yep.
Now, if people are responding to the superintendent, we want them to get back to the superintendent. So I have felt sometimes that what really the the public comment session of the board meeting has been used for is to get a message to the administration. Maybe that's part of clarifying what we're doing at our meeting versus what communication should go to the administration, and the administration can find the appropriate response back.
Yeah. Okay. Mr. Sini?
Yeah, I'm going to just follow up on that. I mean, there was a board meeting in which we were kind of thrown into the cheating scandal, which we had no role whatsoever in that, and it was used as feedback directly to the administration. So, one, if we can maybe separate that in the, God forbid it happens or something different happens, where if you need to solicit feedback from the community, do that within the administration. You know, something at the high school would have been probably more appropriate for that. And I don't mean to rehash it, I'm just trying to give you an example. We have to be careful for you on this one, because we can't create an agenda item based on public comment.
Right.
So, again, educate the public that if it's not on the agenda, you're probably not going to hear us talk about it.
Right.
We'll take it in.
We'll take it in.
Take it
So
in.
I don't know how that feeds into your responses, Dr. Adley.
Yeah.
But third, I think we saw the benefits of creating public hearing or public discussion items in which we can have a back and
Yes.
forth. Use them, again, these are public meetings, but they're not all public hearings. But in certain cases, we do want to be able to respond back and forth. And, you know, the budget process, we often have them and that sort of thing.
So I think that proved effective in hearing from the community, and that we set up that special meeting and we had public hearing where, you know, I think the community felt good about giving their opinions and their questions, and we were able to interact with them in a reasonable timeline. Mrs. McCammon.
Building on that question of a public hearing, I agree with looking for where that's appropriate, you know, for the board specifically. But on the budget process, I think I'd like the board to take up the question of when the budget hearing occurs, because when it occurs, leaves us less flexibility to respond to the public. If the public were to ask us to add or ask us to take off, we need to have already done that work. So I would love for us to look at our process and either move the hearing or change how we handle add-cut. Thank you.
It's part of the budget process.
Yep.
Okay, thank you. Mrs. Parent.
This is related, but also not related. In terms of responding to the public, I meant to ask Patrice what she thought her best practice would be. But when a constituent emails us, the whole board, I understand it is the chair's job to respond back. And I know there are some of us that would just like to respond to simple, like, thank you, I hear you, appreciate your comments. Where do we stand on that? Am I supposed to be completely silent and just let you do that? Can I just write thank you? I just want to clarify so that we are all
I think
on the same page.
it's best, and we can have the discussion here. I think it's best that the chair or the superintendent respond, or I forward it to the superintendent to respond. And that way people understand the chain of command, so
So
to
I
speak.
think-
So we have had the conversation here several times, and part of it is that you can say, thank you
Yeah.
so much.
Yes.
I referred your email to the chairman, as he is the spokesman for the boards of education, he or she, whoever.
Right.
So the person knows that you've received it.
Right.
But the discussion, as I remembered here, is try not to necessarily opine on what, but
Right.
let them know it's been received, it's been followed in the proper chain of command, and where to expect a response from.
I think if you want to acknowledge it, I think that's fine. If it's to Alan, to me, and everyone else, you know.
So I think it's something that whatever form communications eventually takes, it'd be nice to document something like that again, because you want to pass it down through
Right,
time.
and I don't want to seem rude by not
Right,
responding.
right.
You know, I have read this, I appreciate it.
Yeah.
But I also,
I think I've seen other town bodies where they've acknowledged your communication has been received. Thank you.
yeah.
Yeah. Mr. Sini.
I mean, I take a different tact and think it's important that I share my opinion as long as it's extremely clear. But I'm only one member of 9 and don't speak for the board, so I will continue to do that as it's my First Amendment right. Again, not undermining the board's decision. If a decision has been made, you know, you support the decision of the board and move forward, but that's how I continue to go forward with my practice.
Well, that is, so I think this should be brought up to a communications discussion, because, for example, we received a year or two ago an email from a constituent specifically asking, what is your personal position on vaccines? And so that's not something you can necessarily forward to the board chair. Anyway, I think it's worth having a discussion.
Yeah.
But I would also argue that's also and maybe an appropriate response, and so maybe we do need to kind of talk about just training for board responses. I mean, not taking
Yeah.
away anyone's First Amendment right, but my individual opinion on vaccines or X is irrelevant to my work as a board member because I'm not a public health official and there's no issue before the board. So the question was asked and there's an appropriate response that's respectful to a constituent to let them know it's been asked and received. But it's also, I would think, important to clarify what my role is in that.
Right.
And so I think maybe what it is we need to have a discussion or a training, and maybe we have come back down. What's one way, multiple ways of responding to people, but also really telling them about our boards and responsibility when you're operating off your Darien PS.
Yep.
Like, you're operating in a government official at that point. So that's what gets really tricky with all these individual responses, as well-meaning or as accurate as they might be.
So we'll look for some training and have a little further discussion on it, but I think to the point of how you phrased your response to that one particular question, maybe it's also like, hey, are we gonna have, like, do we craft a response that we can all use, which also shows consistency,
Right.
you know, in terms of how we deliver the message?
Yeah, because so maybe the vaccine's not the perfect example, but I've been asked, why did you
good
vote
one.
on
Yeah.
something? You know,
Yeah.
can you explain
Yeah.
your vote?
Yeah,
Or I've
it's a
been
good
told,
one.
I don't like your vote because X, Y, Z. And so, anyway, I think it's
Yeah.
worth discussion.
Good, all right. The only other item I had on here was the PAR report. It's something Al and I discussed. I mean, it's a quick vote at the end, but I don't know, Alan, do you want to touch base on that a little bit?
No, we had brought this up just once before, that to some degree, the actual vote that the board takes is a wee bit perfunctory perhaps, because if typically, well, it'll include retirement, resignations, appointments. So for retirement, it's like, it doesn't matter if you vote or don't vote on it. I mean, you can't stop somebody retiring. So in that nature, that just becomes just an extra wee step. Now, it might be useful as an update to the board to follow the flow of people who come and go and so on and so forth, and recognition also. But the idea of voting on it typically, well, not typically, it's not unusual that we may have had to actually hire someone before it gets here.
Right.
So I'm just putting closure to this discussion whether you want to continue to vote in that capacity or not.
So board conversation, Mrs. Ritchie?
So what I'm hearing is we actually don't need to vote, correct? So maybe if we don't need to vote, I do like to see the report, so I would love for
Strictly
those.
informational.
I would love to have them included, and if
Yeah.
there's something of a special mention, someone
Yeah.
wonderful who's retiring and we want to just give a shout out, that would be nice too.
You know, the goal would be to have it as informational, in case anyone has a question around it, but then the vote just doesn't mean anything, so.
So per policy, it depends on who we're hiring. We've delegated the authority to hire and to the superintendent at the teaching level. At the administrative level, we hire. So if we're hiring an administrator, we need a PAR or something because we have to vote.
Oh, right.
The
Oh, yeah.
teacher
Yeah,
really has
yeah.
been, because for a while we were seeing, at one point the board approved all hires. Then we gave the superintendent the ability to hire at the teaching level. And at one point we were seeing a lot of turnover, and given that the board was no longer hiring, they wanted to see that what was going on. So maybe it's an FYI report
At a level,
on a level.
yeah.
Because
Makes
technically,
sense.
we haven't been voting, we've been voting on the administrators outside of the PAR.
Yeah.
So we've handled those processes separate. Although they've showed up in the PAR, the actual vote's been handled separately.
That's
So
correct.
I still agree, that said, with seeing the information.
Yeah, it's been a little
Yeah.
inconsistent.
Okay. All right, good. Any other further board comment or questions?
I don't want to
yeah.
bring this up, but it just says committee structures. I don't know, did we discuss it or
Oh,
discuss
thank
it?
you. No, just if there's any conversation on the committees we have, I know we're going to have a conversation around the communications work group and that group and the policy group, but I just wanted to make sure we covered, we've got finance, we've got facilities, we've got policy. Is there anything we want to discuss there around the committees, the structures, the meetings? Mr. Sini?
Just, there's often an agenda item, committee reports, and even though committees have met, there's no report, so I guess that's my question, do we need to continue to have that, or do you want committees to report in?
Well, it's a good question. I know Tara will report that we've had a finance committee meeting and it will be discussed later at the meeting. Alan or I have given Ox Ridge reports. Katie gives there's policies. So I don't know, is that a standard line item to have committee reports?
Just from my own experience, typically it has been, yes.
Okay.
Okay,
All
so
right.
I just asked when committees
Yeah,
meet.
I mean, I think they're usually short and sweet. I mean, there's nothing written or anything like that, but Mr. Brown.
So this may be too granular. If it is, I apologize. But just in terms of facilities committee, I know we've had discussions about air conditioners, about types of electricity and power panels and things like that. Are we looking at, say, Wi-Fi and that sort of thing that goes in? Is the committee dealing with those issues as they come through technology, or do we not get into that? And if not, why not, would be my question. And it, not necessarily approval. I mean, we don't question if, how many amps we're going to run to a power panel, but just, so the
Right.
board's aware of what's going on in that infrastructure as well.
So it's a good question. Can I take it offline and do some research and
That'd be great. Of course.
discuss it
Thank you.
further? Yeah, as to where that kind of fits. Mrs. Achman?
So the only thing I would say, just kind of as a FYI to the board, and maybe we could check with Tom or Patrice or something. I believe
Excuse me.
FOIA has ruled that any committee established by the board
Must report.
must report and is subject to FOIA.
Yeah.
So like our strategic planning committee, we ended up with some questions around that. I know the communications work group had to end up fielding some questions about that, but the understanding was different when they began. I think we need to look into that if the
Okay.
board assigns work, it's work of the public.
Right.
And I think that's an understanding of, a new understanding of how we've worked. So I don't think
Makes
anyone
sense.
has
Yeah.
purposely done anything wrong, but I do think FOIA's been pretty strict on that lately.
Okay.
So we want to be cognizant of it. So maybe ask Tom.
I'll get some clarity from Tom, because
Yeah.
maybe it's as simple as the Board of Finance met, we reviewed, it'll be discussed during the meeting, or there's no report from this particular committee.
Yeah, I mean,
so-
the Board of Finance may meet, they won't hear about it from me.
Finance
Finance
committee.
committee.
Finance committee.
Finance
Yeah.
Committee.
So Duke.
All right, Mrs. Ritchie.
So I was adding on that it is important to make sure the public is aware that these committees are meeting. So I didn't have as much information
it's
as
as
Ms.
simple
Achman.
as-
It's just, even if it's a simple, we met and we'll
Yeah.
discuss it more, it is important to make sure that not everybody follows everything we do. Make sure the public knows
Right.
that these committees are meeting on a regular basis.
So I think FOIA's actually gone even broader than that. I think they're saying the meetings actually have to be in public.
Which ours are, right? I mean,
Yeah, I think some of our strategic planning committee hit some questions with it. I think the communications work group fielded some questions last meeting about it. I think it's a new understanding, so
Okay.
I'm not placing blame. I am just saying I think we should be aware of it because we don't want any people who are working
Yep.
hard caught unaware.
I'll get some clarity from Mr.
Yeah.
Mooney around that, too. All right, good. All right, thank you for the, yeah, go ahead.
Just in response to Mr. Brown's comment, it's not unusual, I think you probably know this anyway, it's not unusual for some boards to have committees that are are sort of dual function, whether it's facilities and technology, whether it's, I'm not suggesting this, but I'm just, whether it's policy and curriculum. I know we do curriculum here, but I'm just,
Yeah.
that's not unusual.
Okay, no, it's a good question. Mrs. McCammon?
This is just back to this is a request for Katie, back to the hiring discussion. I think we might want to clarify our policy, because it says submit to the BOE for all of the different kinds of staff. And if we're going to vote on administrative staff, maybe just clarifying that last paragraph, just so we have it for perpetuity. Maybe it's already clear, but if
Take a look.
yeah.
Okay, thanks, Mrs. McCammon. Mrs. Parent?
I just want to raise the question about timing for our subcommittee meetings, if that might be something, I don't know, for those of you that commute into New York, is 8:30 difficult? Would it be better at 8? I mean, I don't know.
They were at 8, they were pushed back to 8:30. I mean, we've tried to accommodate everyone.
Yeah, have I mentioned Zoom at all today for
Yeah.
me?
Yeah, I mean, I think Zoom is going to be a more effective use for, I mean, you
during
don't
the
want
week.
to meet when I typically take the train in the city, so.
Yeah.
So can we then just understand, it may be minor, any additional expense for allowing this capability? Just so we know. I mean, I think it is part of how we are going to operate, but there have to be additional expenses, so we should just be aware of that, because we'll have to make some tweaks to policy, and I think we should just have all the information as we do it.
The Zoom and stuff is in the budget for next year. That's already in.
Yeah, we have staff and late meetings and early meetings, and like I said, I think it's here to stay. I'm not denying that it's here to stay, but I think we should just know all the financial implications, all the policy implications, and just be aware of it as we make that decision.
I'm assuming that the board understands that the executive session, or as agreed, the executive session would not be Zoom orientated.
Correct.
Right.
Yeah. Good. All right, thank you, Mrs. Ackman.
When you say executive session would not be Zoom orientated, what
Oh,
is
sorry, you couldn't participate via Zoom.
Okay.
Good. All right.
And maybe just go on and explain that, just so everybody understands why.
So typically in a meeting, if you're zooming into a regular meeting, well, it's a public meeting. Everybody's like, your wife could be there, your kids could be there, right? But they could be here and seeing the same thing. But in an executive session, they're precluded from that, and there's no way of telling. Like it's just a.
No, that's good, thank you.
There was no way of identifying who's in the room with you.
Understood.
Sitting on the train.
I
next to
wanted
you.
him just.
It might go better if somebody else is there. I don't know, but it's just.
No. I
Good.
just want to make
Yeah.
sure that was stated, so
Good,
we all.
good clarification. Good. All right, thank you for that conversation around that. We'll have some follow-up around that. Moving on to review of student activities fund and accounting manual. Dr. Adley and Mr. Rudel, thank you for all the information you put together. It's pretty comprehensive, and so I'll turn it over to Dr. Adley and Mr. Rudel.
Mr. Chairman, may I ask permission just to touch briefly on conceptually? I don't know if you feel it fits, but I kind of feel it fits. We talked about board goals this morning, and we talked about board operations and just how I intend to bring back to the board. Like, where do we sit with that? Is it okay to mention that within that?
Sure.
Is that okay with the board members?
Yeah.
Yeah, so we're staying in number 4, board operations.
Yep.
Just for the moment,
That's fine. Yep.
operationally. So last year, the July meeting, we did the first draft of the goals. So that's what the intention is again to do. I heard today that maybe in the future we bring back goals to this discussion, which is fine. So I think what has worked, and even in our own discussions, I think what has worked, where I've sort of solicited along the way, whether it's a report or whether it's something else, what your thoughts might be before I sort of bring some stuff. So my intention would be, based on this morning and just based on some thoughts, that Patrice sort of broke this up into sort of board goals, board operational goals, and then the district goals, right? So I'm thinking along the lines of, and you can certainly give me any indication between now and then as to, I'd like one in this area or one in that area. One would definitely be the implementation of the strategic plan. What I don't want to do is just overload all of us with stuff that we know what we have to do, which is really embedded in that strategic plan. So one would be around the execution of the strategic plan. Just based on this morning, one might be the adoption of I'll word it better, but the adoption of self-improvement goals. It may actually be one of them. And then you've got a couple of them that we've already mentioned there off to the side a little bit. Others could be around any specific thing that's not mentioned in the strategic plan, it might be of a facilities nature to manage the three projects that we're going to have going on. It could be something around that. So my main thing is strategic goal. You could still do something around, we don't know what the opening of school is going to be like, right? So it still could be around something about opening and maintaining it in the pandemic or the next version of this. But essentially, the major one would be the strategic plan one. And so I'll leave it there and pick your brain as to what you think of that. Without saying any words around it, that's kind of what I would be bringing back as a proposal around those types of topics.
Mrs. McCammon.
Well, I agree with either. I would say there's two approaches: either keep it really high level because we already have the strat plan, or develop some lower level goals that kind of fall from the strat plan, and then it would be a lot more extensive. But I kind of like the idea of being pretty high level and using the strategic planning framework the way it is.
Well, within the strategic plan, the governance is overseeing that, and keeping me accountable for actually moving it along.
Mrs. Ackman.
So I think agreeing with Mrs. McCammon, like, that sounds great as a hint to what we're seeing, but it's hard to agree until we actually see
that's fine.
something
Yeah, of
more
course.
formalized. I mean, if you're giving us a heads up of your direction,
That's correct.
that's fine. It's just not a lot to go on.
No. I'm
Okay.
not. I'm actually using today to try and this is the strategy sort of moving forward. Is that?
Mrs. Ritchie.
So just to understand timing, we'll get a first look at goals and objectives at the July meeting, and then it would be an action item for the August meeting.
Right,
Is that what the
yes,
hope
that's
is?
right.
And then we develop our master agenda after we
Correct, yeah.
establish our goals and objectives.
So respectfully, I'm sorry. Are we not a little late if we're waiting till August to get going on the goals and objectives for the administration to like?
No, the
Opening of
well,
school in September?
it would be the July 22nd, is it? So the next meeting in July will be the draft of the goals.
Yeah, and then we wouldn't approve them
Till the next. Yeah.
until the August meeting. We only have one meeting.
Because the strategic planning process really has taken over a lot of what we used to do. A lot of that work that we would have done in the summer really got front-loaded into the strat planning process. There is work that falls outside of it that would need to be captured, but a lot of the kind of what's the focus of each of those categories should show up in the strat plan.
No, I agree. I'm just saying in terms of the board approving, so the administration having approval and going out and work, if what you're saying is you're going out and working on it and we're just approving it after, it just feels a little late in the summer. So I don't know if there's a way to expedite, to actually give you our approval for us to review something.
I personally don't think I need to. Personally, I think the timing is okay for me because what things are going on simultaneously. Because I don't think something's going to drop out of the sky so significantly different.
Do you think too? I think after we see the initial draft of it, if we need to call a special meeting, some way, shape, or form, we can do that to focus on that. Okay.
And we could, I think to your point, Tara, maybe decide, okay, this year we felt like we needed to shift it earlier and make sure that it's adjusted.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm
All
just
right.
pointing out the
Good.
timeline.
No, thank you, Mrs. Ackman. All right.
And the only other thing I would put on the table with that board operations is the nature of this meeting, because there's a wee bit of a discussion of are we covering too much with business and so on and so forth. So these things are always on the master agenda. So I'm working off the master agenda, what comes when and what goes in it. So if there is a desire to look, can you keep off all the business stuff? Then certainly we can have that decision. But
Yeah, so, I got some feedback about business versus discussion. I actually talked to Mr. Mooney and reviewed the agenda with him. He thought it was an appropriate agenda. He said, chances are you're always going to have some business you want to conduct. He goes, it's really what you all want to make the board retreat about and the discussions that you want to have. He said that the evaluation is key, usually the superintendent's contract. He said goals and objectives. He said, and then you can discuss any items that you want to clear up or get done or move forward. He goes, those are always good things to have on a retreat, to spend the time to talk about them. But I think, what I would do going forward is I would like to have it earlier. It's tough with the end of school year and vacations, but then also have a little more feedback beforehand from board members as to what else you want to see on it or what you want to discuss. So that's my 2 cents. Mr. Brown?
I just would like to say I thought this was a great agenda, and I thought it was great to take some items that have been lingering for a number of years and kind of take them off the table. So I'm glad we have them on the agenda.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Brown. Mrs. Stein?
Well, I had sent an email into Alan and Duke with some of those concerns. I think historically, and I'm going to take last year out of it because with COVID, we were late with the superintendent's contract, other things, because it was a crazy year. But historically, from the time we started the retreat, which initially was off-site, it was always around, to Mr. Brown's point, sort of lingering issues as a board that we didn't have time to really dig into in our regular agendas. And it was always goals and objectives, it was evaluations and superintendent's contract. And I felt like this agenda looked very much like a regular agenda. It didn't even have the word retreat on it anywhere for the public to understand that. So I would just like to see, you know, I have no problem doing business, but there was one year, I think it was 17 or 18, we had it as a separate pre-meeting. So we did business and then we adjourned to the retreat, which is our time as a board to sort of workshop things, talk about things. There shouldn't be public comment, in my opinion, on a board retreat. It's our work session. So those were my concerns that I sent in, and you know, you can forward the email to the board for them to see, but that was my 2 cents. And I have no problem doing business on this date because I know July gets busy and there are things you need to vote on. I was just saying separate them out.
Good points. Thank you, Mrs. Stein.
So just for the record, the items for to be discussed at this meeting are on that master agenda, and those are the things that we continue to add those onto. I did seek clarification last year whether to call it retreat or not, and we got the clarification back to call it a special meeting. So, but anyway, as long as we decide what you want to do moving forward, I'm good.
I think there's a balance to what legal warnings are, kind of what today is, what we signal to the public today is, who's tuning in. I think generally, I love that we have people on Zoom, and I know it's probably for the student activities manual. It's probably where they're most interested. But I do think that, I don't know that a lot of the town is, well, I'd say this, look, I planned and ran meetings where the criticism was, hey, you're talking about that during the day and it's a topic of interest and we want to be part of it. So I think we just have to be cognizant of regular business during the retreat. Or at least signaling it as such. And maybe in the past, as we've warned a separate meeting, we could at least point to people and say we warned, you know, this. But that all goes into how you all organize the agenda.
Good. Thank you, Mrs. Ackman. Very good.
I'm good.
All right.
I think we can just celebrate
ahead.
for a moment that we did an evaluation this morning.
Yes.
From
Yes, that's good.
And that we're, you know,
And then everything
continuing
else
to
we
be-
did.
Yeah, open and discuss, because these are important topics, and it's good when we can come to consensus.
Yeah, and it was hard last year because I think this year, I think Patrice was saying she got full participation. Last year, I think we only had 2 or 3 people send in their evaluation.
Yeah. No, it was good. I appreciate everyone participating. It was a good session. So, all right, are you good, Dr. Adley?
We are, sir. Yep.
All right, good. So we will move on to the review of Student Activities Fund and Accounting Manual. Dr. Adley and Mr. Rudel, thank you again for compiling all the information. So I will turn it over to you.
So thank you again. This is one of those items that was on the master agenda that we deferred to this meeting. Thank you again for the questions, because they tend to help, whether it's a report or whether it's an analysis of a topic. They tend to be very helpful to us in terms of trying to incorporate those thoughts, and obviously it would meet your needs if those were incorporated. So with that, you do have the memorandum. You have the student activities manual there, the accounting manual. So that's been reviewed and discussed, and I'll ask Rich just to walk through the highlights of a memorandum, and then perhaps we open up for discussion. I do think it probably gives us all a good starting point on foundation again on what is actually happening or not happening. So that will be a, I think, good thing for everyone. So with that, Mr. Rudel.
So Connecticut statute does establish Board of Ed to create accounts.
Mr. Rudel, could you just pause a wee moment, please?
Lunch delivery.
Is it a lunch? Well then, keep talking.
Yeah.
So we can't close the door.
Wait.
It's frustrating. Sorry, Michelle, we're not allowed to close the door. We have to have like one door open.
Doors ajar.
All right, Mr.
take
Rudel,
two.
thank you.
Yep. So Connecticut statute does provide boards of education to establish and maintain student activity accounts. Those accounts are supposed to complement student activities, but not conflict or supplant activities taking place. The district does have 8 accounts, one for each school, and then a district-wide student activity account. Within each school, there are essentially sub-accounts with individual line items that support the various clubs, activities, or sports within the respective school. Just looking at last year, we did sweep accounts. Prior to that, fiscal 18 was the time before that where accounts were swept. We did provide historically the balances for the last 3 years. You can see it was $416,000 in fiscal 19, down to $370 in fiscal 20, and $339,000 in fiscal 21. When looking at some of the accounts, it is important to know one that probably stands out the most is sailing. It does operate typically as like a sinking fund. They accumulate funds over a period of years, and then when they're accumulated enough funds, they actually purchase new sailboats. So they have 6 sailboats. It typically costs about $60,000 to get those new sailboats, so they're a couple of years away from getting that. But if you look at the total balance, that's probably about 15% of the total balance district-wide. So all the money is collected, must be accompanied by a deposit form indicating the name or the team, a club, activity, etc., and the amount collected and the avenue in which it's collected. Athletic funds must be approved by the athletic director, music funds by the director of music, and then other funds approved by the principal of the given school or assistant principal. Each month we do a bank reconciliation, is performed in the business office, and then we also do a random selection of invoices just to make sure that everything is appropriate within the student activity accounts. Funds are either collected through School Cash Online, which is the most prominent form in which we collect funds. It is the most preferred method because it does take a significant amount of cash out, but funds are also collected by check and cash, and those funds are collected with a deposit form and deposited in the appropriate account. When funds are swept, they are taken from the 7 school bank accounts and then moved into the district-wide account. Funds that are earmarked to be swept are any items that are considered not committed and over $1,000 in a given category. Someone asked about comparable districts. So currently we have a part-time bursar at the high school who manages the Darien High School student activity account. The middle school is managed by the principal secretary along with the principal. And then at the elementary schools, it is the elementary principal or assistant principal. And as I mentioned earlier, we do bank reconciliations in the business office. Westport currently has a full-time bursar at the high school and then a similar structure at their middle and elementary. New Canaan has a full-time bursar at their high school and then a similar structure at the elementary and middle. Weston, being a smaller district, has a full-time district-wide bursar who manages all 4 schools. And then Ridgefield has a part-time bursar at the high school and then a similar structure at the middle and elementary schools. Reporting procedures, we do use a system called School Cash Online, which tracks and manages and reports on all activity for the student activity accounts. It allows us to run trial balances on a monthly basis and provide that to the administrator of the different areas so that they can see what balances are available. The Student District Activity Manual is definitely a well-crafted document, and it definitely serves the district very, very well. I have gotten numerous calls from counterparts in other districts asking about our student activity manual and wanting to use portions of it for their own internal guidelines. So it is definitely really a premier document within Fairfield County, at least, if not the state of Connecticut. We did make a couple of recommendations. As you can see from the balances, we do have a high level of funds within the district-wide student activity account. We did sweep last year close to $70,000. And prior to that, fiscal 19, there was no sweep. In fiscal 18, there was a sweep of about $20,000. So that district-wide student activity account is typically used for scholarships. We definitely don't issue that much in terms of scholarships to withdraw that balance. So the purpose of sweeping accounts is to ensure that you're not maintaining unnecessarily high balances. So currently, we're essentially lowering the balances in the 7 schools, but then you have the push up in that 8th district-wide account. So maybe more of a broadened scope of what those funds could be used for, as you don't want to have to carry those high balances indefinitely. Currently, the limit on scholarships is $50. Typically, the most scholarship requests we get are at the high school, and they're typically for AP exams. The process typically works where the guidance counselor will suggest a scholarship of $100, goes to the principal, in this case Ellen, and she approves it at $50, and then a scholarship is granted Given the balance in the account and the type of scholarship request, we are recommending maybe raising that threshold from $50 to $100, and then even considering anything that's over $200 being 50% of the cost. And then a third is currently the district does collect gate receipts similar to other districts for football and basketball. In other districts like Ridgefield, Weston, Wilton, and New Canaan, the gate receipts are used to offset police and security. It shows you as either a contract account or a revenue account. Currently, police and security are budgeted in RC11 and sports officials. So we are recommending creating a contract account in RC11 called gate receipts, and then the gate receipts would be credited against RC11, so you'd see a line item for gate receipts to offset some of those costs associated with police or security. In the past, gate receipts were either swept into the district account or they were used to support the Turkey Bowl that one year in, I think, 2019.
Okay. Anything to add, Dr. Reagan?
No, that's operationally how things are running, and I'm sure we'll have questions that may be helpful.
Sure. So again, Rich, thank you. It's the most comprehensive overview I've seen of it. And I know all the hard work that was put onto the manual, but seeing all the accounting behind it. Could you just clarify up front, and I think I know, but just clarity's sake, where and how do the funds flow? So aside from the gate receipts, donations are going in here from car washes, from, have we charged for, I don't think I've been to chorus. We haven't charged for chorus. Do we charge for theater? Do those funds go in there? Donations, is the $100 or whatever student activity fee go in here? Like, what all goes in here?
So it's a combination of a few things. Schools can post what's called a catalog item in School Cash Online. So if maybe they're selling a mug or a water bottle, things like that to raise money, you could post a catalog item, parents can pay for that item, and then that money is collected and then deposited in whatever the specific account is, if it's an athletic account, a music account, or whatever, or a student-centered account. If it's car washes, funds are raised. If it's football or hockey, for example, those funds are raised and typically deposited into the individual sport account, so hockey or football in that case. In some cases, dues that are charged to students are collected and deposited into the student activity account. Sometimes they do fundraisers, whether it's selling pieces of equipment or program space or plaques or things like that. Those funds will also go into the student activity account. There's something called a blue list, so if money is paid for an item in arrears, it's typically like library books is a good example. If a library book is lost and not recovered, there's a charge for a library book. Those small amounts actually go into the library account that you see within the individual schools. So those are really like the sources of revenue that you see within. And then again, donations that fall within the approved threshold.
And those donations are in what you put in that report that you give us on donations?
Correct. So if it's a sports donation, it will go in whatever that sport account is, or if it's music donation, et cetera.
Okay, good, thank you. Mrs. Stein.
I have a lot of questions. I'll start with an overarching question. And I was here when we made this manual. I did it with Mr. Cicchetti. It was done in 2015, and none of our threshold numbers have changed. To your point, the $50 for scholarship. Have we taken a holistic view on thresholds for gifts, thresholds for donations for coaches' gifts, teachers? I think if we're going to change scholarship, we should really look at all those numbers, because it's been 7 years and I think they're a little out of date. So I'd love to see that. I'll let other people go. I have.
Keep going.
Keep going.
Go ahead.
Okay, my next question. So the general account, the general activities account, well, no, I'll start with another easier one. Sorry. Can we edit this document to include School Cash Online? Because that is our main system that we use now for accounting for the most part, right? Unless it's cash through gate receipts or car wash, the majority of funds should be flowing through School Cash Online, and it's not mentioned anywhere in here as the system we're using in the manual.
In the manual.
So you certainly can, if you would choose to, let's say, not use School Cash Online down the road, you would just have to change the manual to reflect whatever system you're using.
Okay,
but we do try to steer people to School Cash Online as much as possible, because it takes away that cash risk.
Yeah, I think it's helpful to put it in there. you want me to keep going?
Go
Okay.
ahead.
General activities account. That is, there's not a general account in each school. There's just one. So when accounts get swept, they go to the general activities account. Correct. Okay. Can you just tell us, sort of looking back, how often clubs or teams or activities have accessed that account? Is that, I mean, I know some is scholarship, but it is also there when there's a deficit.
Yep. So in my time here, prior to my time here, it was never accessed. This past year, the high school did request access for it to support end-of-year activities for seniors. We did grant funds from those so that they wouldn't either have to raise more money or they wouldn't go into a deficit like you mentioned. Typically, it's only small amounts of money for scholarships. So this year, there really wasn't a lot because there were no field trips, there were no guest authors, there weren't as much going on at the middle school because of the type of school year we had. The biggest request this past year, as I mentioned, was for the senior class.
So just to Katie, just to clarify your question, were you asking after the money has been swept, has anyone gone and asked
I'm going
to
to go,
access?
I'll clarify further. If you go to page 5 on the activities manual, under athletic teams, if you read the second paragraph, assuming there's no Title IX compliance, if a team has a shortfall, they're supposed to first request funds from the general activity account, which I don't believe is happening. So I think there's a lot of editing that I'd love to do to this manual. There are things that we are not practicing that are in here that really need to be, if we're really gonna do this, we gotta do it and do it right. Because that, I know that's not happening and you pretty much just confirmed
So there were no
it.
requests from the athletic director.
Right, but so then
this past
before
year.
any fundraiser should happen, that should be happening. As I
There
read
should be a
this,
request if there's a
which is
deficit.
not at all the
Right.
practice. So I think two things out of this. I think we should figure out what practice is and align this manual. There's a lot of areas where it's not how we do things. But I think the other big thing, which I've raised every time we've discussed this manual, is it sits here, it's a document, but it's not implemented. And people aren't using it as a living document. I know a lot of, there are inconsistencies in team, you know, I will use the high school as an example because I live and breathe it, but captains' parents who've been informed about it, some haven't. We have to find a way to get everybody who will be using, you know, sort of this manual, whether it's student athletes, parents, you know, team parents, club advisors, theater, everyone has to know what's in this and adhere to it because it's still not happening. And
I guess
that is my biggest
But Rich, to that
concern.
point, the thing I hear most often, and some of it comes from I think the parent reps up to Darien Heights, there seems to be like some transparency issue with this in terms of people knowing, maybe it's to your point, knowing what's in there so that they do have the ability to go ask for it versus doing a fundraiser. So I don't know how or who disseminates the information or the monthly accounting.
Yep.
But I just have constantly heard this transparency issue with people. And the bad part is the rumors out there are there's hundreds of thousands, there's $1 million in these accounts. And I've heard those rumors over the years. And while there might be, yes, a couple $100,000 in there, if you look through how and what it's used and how and what's raised, it makes sense. But I think to Katie's point, it's how is this transparent? How is it used? How does it align to practice daily?
And I think maybe talking with Chris Manfredonia, Ellen at the high school particularly, because that's where a lot of questions come from, is setting out at the beginning of the school year, you know who your team captains are, and by extension the parents, having a meeting where you really go through this and say, because people start fundraising, even if you have a spring sport, you may start fundraising in the fall, but it should be an annual thing. And to make Chris's life easier, instead of doing team by team, one-on-one, maybe you do a group, kind of like our, you know, orientation, where it's, you gotta go to it, at least one parent and one student representative have to show up, and because there's still people not using school cash online, there's still cash being exchanged. It's just, there's not consistency, and that's why we get a lot of the feedback we get.
Mrs. Parent.
So I think we have to be cognizant that these are parent dollars, right, that are sitting and they're not being used effectively. So I just want to clarify for my own understanding, take the wrestling mat, for example. Is this something the wrestling team, when that wrestling mat was not included in our budget, could the wrestling team have gone back and said, we would like to use some of those funds for this? Like, where's the line, and where does it stand for?
So wait, time?
Yep, go ahead.
Yeah, no. Is that your question? Yeah.
I have more, but yes.
Rich, do you want to?
So the item first and foremost has to be a student-centered item. So it can't be anything that's going to support staff or something that's going to be stripped out of your operating budget and then supplant the operating budget. If it's something that the team could fundraise for, typically the process would be that coach has to go, if it's athletics, for example, the coach would have to go to Chris as the athletic director. The athletic director is going to have to make a decision as to whether or not it's something worth fundraising for or not, and then it's his obligation to request first money from the student activity account. So similar to what happened at the end of the year, Ellen made a request from that district-wide account to support end-of-year celebrations for the high school students.
Okay, Mrs. Ritchie had her hand up, and then I'll get you, Mrs.
Yeah, well, it sort of has been covered, but I think I was going to add on to Katie's points about informing specifically the captain parents and having a meeting like that, and even maybe creating a sort of a cheat sheet so they understand the process, they understand what's going on and how these accounts work, because I get the sense that many don't understand it, and each team does operate very differently. So I think it's important to have a clear understanding of how that process
Well,
works.
I think to Mrs. Stein's point, it's like the meetings I've gone to with my kids. You acknowledge you're there, you acknowledge the rules of the sport and how everything's going to play out. So it's something along those lines. Mrs. Achman.
So I do think we have to make sure that we're clear. The student activities account is outside of tax dollars, right? So Mr. Rudel is correct. We can't use it to supplant the operating budget, right? So if there's a determination that something in the operation budget is not necessary and the team wants to request money, this could be a place they could go. That's kind of a very thin line, so we have to walk it really tightly, because supplanting the operation, we're supposed to provide for the educational needs of our children, right? I think that a lot of teams don't know that this money is available, and really part of this might be like the administration really making clear. I mean, I hear, I'm sure like everyone does, from teams that say, oh, this team has money, we don't have money. There is money available. If you can't meet your needs, you just need to go through the approval process.
Correct.
And I really think we need to stress that. I think we need to be, at one point at the board table, we heard we were no longer taking cash, outside of federal law and all that we can't deny cash. But it wasn't that we were steering people to school cash online. We were no longer exchanging cash. And so I also think that that's gotten very inconsistent. Some people are dealing cash, some people are dealing school cash online. Car washes, buy tickets beforehand. I really think what this is more about is educating. Maybe it's the staff, so they know fully, but maybe it's the parents too. They know what's available to them, because none of us want to be carrying necessarily balances this high if there's a need. And also, we don't want to be asking our parents to fundraise money with balances this high necessarily. So I think we have a really good manual. I would agree with Mrs. Stein. I think it's really about implementation. And these monies have compiled because people don't know it's available to them.
And we've been trying to actually make sure that the practices that we are doing align to this manual, because it's very well constructed. The other question I heard occasionally is, we don't know what's in it. Well, essentially anybody can request to see what's in it, the way they could request anything. If that should come from the high school administration, the athletic department, as a first request. If for some reason people aren't getting that information, then that should come through. Next would be the principal. Thereafter, that would be Rich and myself. People can see what's in this because it's public information. So there should not be any question about how much do I have in the actual account. At least not getting an answer to that.
So there is. That question comes up all the time, but I think it goes to people understanding the manual, having a couple of meetings up there, making sure the staff is on board too. I just think that's a constant conversation I hear, is about the transparency of what is actually in these accounts.
I think historically Chris, and he's not here, but you can confirm, would meet individually with, say, the soccer parents, the sailing parents, this. I personally, and there are individual things that can be addressed, but I do think if you sort of have a big meeting and you have one representative from each team club activity, you can get it done a lot quicker, and people will actually listen, pay attention. If you have to have other meetings to discuss other things, fine, but I think it's an easy way at the start of the school year to get everybody on the same page in terms of how we are raising money and spending money.
Mr. Steeney.
So, Rich, who's the fiduciary of this account? Is it the Board of Ed or like?
Their Board of Ed accounts, yeah.
Okay, so might I suggest that on a quarterly basis, is it tough to compile a report or update to the Finance Committee at least, or the board?
Nope, I mean,
in
we
terms of
just run it-
balances? So that, I think that's one way to get information out there and what the balances are and such. Two, I think the millions of dollars comment, they're misunderstanding cash flow in and out versus balances, right? So do we know how much cash typically on average the last 3 years comes in and gets dispersed?
So last year's not a good year as an example.
Please take
But I mean, you definitely have over $500,000 going in a normal year, going in and out.
Okay.
We did sweep, like I mentioned, about $70,000. A lot of that was just historical balances that have been left. I would expect this year the sweep to probably be closer to about $10,000. But for the most part, it's pretty close to coming in and then going out, the debits and credits.
Okay. Mrs. Ritchie.
So it would be great, yes, to get maybe not a quarterly, I would think an annual update just to where the accounts are. The other question I had is, don't we sweep these accounts annually? Yes. Okay, because it seemed like maybe we hadn't done it every year.
So
there hasn't been consistency.
So I did
Okay,
sweep.
I thought we were supposed to do that every year.
So I did sweep the accounts last year, all 7. That's how you got to that about $70,000. The year before, nothing was swept, and the year before that, 3 schools were swept, but the other 4 were not.
So they were not swept because there were things that were encumbered for.
No, there were definitely balances available. I don't know why I wasn't here.
Okay.
But the manual says you can have balances up to 1,000 in certain accounts with, so that like,
Some of them
there is-
ran over. It was a new accounting practice recommended. There were a lot of teams and clubs that were very concerned that their money had been raised and was now being swept. And so I think it was part of a gradual rollout and explaining that if Club X raised this money, they weren't raising money for the entire school, but if they couldn't use the money and they'd over-raised, that like this would be available for scholarships. So but I feel as if maybe it was a phase-in that was slower than it should have been.
But I also think some of the money we also allowed, as I remember the discussion, was for purchase orders came at different times. So if you were sweeping accounts, certain teams needed to buy things over the summer, so they needed access to funds. My question to you is, I notice in your narrative, you talk about sweeping accounts August, September. Why wouldn't we do it at the close of our fiscal year?
Sure. So unlike Munis, so School Cash Online doesn't allow you to encumber things. So one of the things that we do, the elementaries are a lot easier. There's not a lot of ins and outs. So we do provide the principal, or if it's athletics, the athletic director, or music, the director of music, their balances. We want to make sure that we have anything earmarked. So there are occasions where something's over 1,000 because they might have that pending invoice to come out. Or they have an earmark where they don't have a pending invoice, but they raised money, let's say in the spring, and the expectation was to make that purchase maybe in August. So we want to have those sign-offs. In terms of just the larger process in the business office, we do have to close out the operating budget, and we have state reports that if we don't finish by a certain date, the board gets fined. So we focus on that first, and since these are agency accounts where the money doesn't get lost, then they can accumulate and roll over.
Thank you.
Mrs. Ritchie.
So when at what point in time snapshot do the auditors look at when they're auditing these accounts?
The close of June 30th. Yep.
Something that jumped out at me in your narrative is that a lot of schools, a lot of school districts comparable to our size do have full-time bursars at their high schools, and given all the accounts that are being managed, is that something that we should be thinking about potentially for the future?
The high school's obviously your biggest account, so probably.
I'm just saying they're probably going to ask for it, is what I'm saying.
Okay, it jumped out at me. It seemed like it might be something that would be coming, so I just thought I'd touch upon it.
Although we're talking about hiring staff because we have so much money coming in as gifts. Like, I mean, I feel like there is a management FTE issue here we could do. I'm sorry, Mrs. McCammon.
Go ahead. Yeah. Go ahead, Mrs. McCammon.
Well,
related to that point, I think, Sarah's point that this is parent money, I think we need to be pretty strong about figuring out ways to use it. This is, I think, too high a balance for us to be carrying year over year. The ins and outs is fine, but I don't think we want to accumulate dollars. So I support any efforts to make that happen.
So we are trying to make sure that things that are raised is purposeful and it's going to get used. It is a high balance, and we want to reduce it if we can.
And related to that, the one comment I keep hearing is, do we have the right flexibility? And again, I think that goes back to the point that's being made, which is around education. Because if we have something that fails for a team or a club or what have you during the year, we do have flexibility, and we just want to make sure people know that it's there. Other things noted here, I fully support changing the gate receipt accounting to be in line with what you're recommending. And I agree with whatever interval we decide, including this in an accounting update. Thank you.
Hey, Rich, just getting a little into the weeds, if you look through some of the elementary schools, why would some elementary schools have Darien school lunch program and others not have that?
Could you name the specific school?
Yeah, so I don't see that in Hinley, but I do see it in Holmes. There's been no money in it since 19. And then it's just, I'm wondering if it's something we should be or capturing or we're not. And then there was one other school that had lunch program, but the others did not.
So in some instances, the PTO will provide a lunch for students at the end of the year. So typically what happens is that check will get deposited in the student activity account, and then it's written from the student activity account to the school lunch program. It's really an accounting mechanism to have it. So what you're seeing is really the revenue deposited in 2019, but because it's zeroed out in 20, the check was issued in 20.
Got it. Just triggered that account.
Yep.
Okay, Mr. Sini.
Yeah, I just want to underscore, I do support better matching the revenues at certain events to support the expenses to hold those events. It is a vast majority of parent money, but that will have a tiny impact in terms of how it impacts our budget and taxpayer dollars as well.
So on library books and subscriptions, this might be too in the weeds, but you've got some schools that seem to, this is fees they collect on late fees or lost books?
So it could be late fees related to a book. It could be a charger for a Chromebook. It could be anything related to that.
So some schools collect, some schools don't collect. I mean, again, I think it's consistency in some of it. Some seem to do a lot more than others. So, all right, Mr. Maroney.
I have two questions. One is much more specific, and I'll take that first. So, gate receipts for state playoffs, is that our money or is that CIAC money?
CIAC money.
So if you host a state playoff game, you have to pay for the security and everything with that, and no, you don't get the reimbursement from the gates. Okay, clear. My second question is more of a broader question, I guess, is with the ability to go and get money from the general account, what does that do to the Blue Wave Booster Club? And is that being used to circumvent clubs from requesting the money from the general account?
Possibly.
And should we be reviewing the gifts a little more scrupulously of, did you go through the proper process to request the money before accepting said gift?
And that's what we're trying to do, make sure that they go through that process first, and that there's a reason for this gift to being accepted in the first place. So the answer is yes, you should.
Okay, clear. Thank you.
So, Rich, in your view, or Dr. Adley, in moving, to John's point about accounting, and moving those gate receipts to covering expenses associated with security and police, does that create a shortfall in dollars needed for end-of-year stuff up at the high school?
No.
It does not?
It does not. So if we look at the gate receipts in the past, part of it was to fund the Turkey Bowl in that one given year.
Right.
But in the future, if you were to make this adjustment, typically what you would see is if the year the Turkey Bowl was going to be in Darien, you'd have your expenses up in your operating budget for however you need to construct it, and then you'd have higher gate receipts in the operating budget that year as well. So there will be some slight fluctuation in terms of how high gate receipts are, and it's really, do you have a Turkey Bowl in one year or do you not have the Turkey Bowl in one year? Okay. But for the most part, those gate receipts are collected and they sit in an inner athletic account, and part of that was swept last year.
Okay, so that accounting change makes sense. Mrs. Parent?
So building off of what Dennis was saying about the Blue Wave Booster Club, I was unaware until we got the email from the DHSPA that they give preferred parking and tickets to become, to with a certain level of donors. Are those tickets purchased, or does the district give them those tickets? Because that's lost revenue for us. If so, if they're given, are there other organizations, are they given that opportunity as well? Like, do we sell preferred parking to the musical, and then that money goes to 308? Like, I think we have to be really consistent in what we're doing, and I don't know that we are. So I'm curious as to.
So they are donated.
They are donated.
They are donated.
Okay, if they're.
To Sarah's point, do the other organizations know that there's that opportunity?
So historically, in talking to Chris, just on a couple of occasions, they've donated tickets to some elementary schools for fundraisers, but for the most part, no. That doesn't happen.
So what is the value of what we, like,
How many tickets?
how many tickets, I mean, how
That
much?
I would have to check
yeah.
into how many.
I don't,
I mean, from
Yeah.
my understanding, it's a certain donor level. It's pretty
Yeah.
high. So I'm just.
Right.
yeah, I just pulled it up. It's 500
It'd be
and
nice
over.
to understand
Yeah.
how many there are.
Yeah.
I mean, if
Okay.
we're talking about 12 tickets a year or something
Yeah.
like that.
But I think that opportunity should be extended for arts activities and,
Yeah,
other things
everyone
too.
should know
So-
that the opportunity's there from an equity standpoint. Mrs. Ritchie?
Just getting the financials of the police and security, what is typically in the budget? And I know it fluctuates, like you said, for years we host a turkey bowl or something like that, but what is in that line item, how much? I'm just trying to, and the gate receipts is typically like 10,500 is the last.
So it's usually, between 10 and 12,000 unless you have a turkey bowl. I would have to pull the specific security cost to give you a good idea of what that is.
Mrs. Achman?
So just on the accounting change to RC11, if we bring in gate receipts, I just think we should be aware that that's kind of a change in philosophy of those dollars. It also opens up those dollars available for transfer, available for debate during the budget. It's no longer kind of kid-raised, kid-based, or student-raised, student-based, student activities. It becomes part of the operating budget, and it is as available as any other dollar in our budget. So it's a philosophy change. It might be the right decision to make, but it is a significant philosophy change. The turkey bowl, its expenses become a budget debate. Security.
It's revenues, not
I'm sorry?
I'm sorry, it's revenues would.
Yes,
right?
yes.
Not
So,
expenses.
or any other gate receipts we then use, which we did in the year, to have it that then go towards, become part of the budget discussion. So it's a philosophy change as much as it's an accounting change. And so we just need to acknowledge that should we make the change that we're willing to do that.
So I guess to that, go ahead, Mr.
No,
Brown.
it's a change in the mechanism. We don't have to change the philosophy. I mean, we could have a discussion as a board and be like, yeah, this is from the turkey bowl, we're not touching it next. I mean, we could still have that philosophy.
Well, I would tell you that any dollar in the budget is available for both administrative transfer or board transfer. Right now, the student activities account are subject to the student activities manual. So there's now a differing governing body. The board could say that for one event a year, it's going to look at budget dollars differently. I wouldn't advise that either. I'm not saying don't do it. I'm just saying recognize the philosophy change when you do it.
Yeah, okay.
So what's the philosophy too when you're talking about gate receipts that we're just charging for football and basketball and no other events?
Sure. So typically, at least throughout Fairfield County, football and basketball are the only sports that collect gate receipts. Part of that, especially with football, is more of the need for security or campus monitors around, but that is typically the practice in the area.
Okay. Mrs. McCammon?
To that question about theater, then how does that work? Because they collect too, but that goes directly to like 308 because they don't. That's how they fund.
So they do fundraisers. They might do like wreath sales or things like that.
Right.
Those revenues are collected and put into the appropriate account, typically at the high school. And then their expenditures, whether it's a trip that they have to do or if it's a play or something that they're putting on, the expenses associated with that come out of that account.
But same for gate receipts, if you will?
Same thing.
Tickets?
Same thing.
Okay.
What was that, John?
Well, again, I just wanted, so the tickets there are going into the,
Student activity account.
yeah, and is there any additional security or any other expenses? you need there?
Typically, you just have fire watch.
Okay.
But it goes to the point of consistency. If you're gonna, if those dollars are gonna offset costs like that, we have to be consistent across, whether it's fire watch or full-blown security for a football game, there has to be consistency there. Any other questions? Rich, my one thought is, and I don't know enough about it, I was kind of, wow, I didn't know they had vending machines at these schools. Is that something we should push toward Chartwell? Do we need vending machines? What's in them? Is that something we roll up under Chartwell since they're doing such a great job?
Sure. So it's under, it is a state law that the money collected from vending machines goes to support students. Typically, it supports students who are blind. So it's not a lot of money.
Say that again?
Students who are so students with disabilities.
Okay.
But all the money goes to whatever student activity account is in that given school. So if Holmes has X amount of money in a vending machine, it goes towards that.
But then the school pays for the purchase to fill those vending machines
Within the student activity account.
within the student activity account.
So Chartwell's also does not do vending machines.
Okay, all right, good, thank you. Mr. Sini.
So can I just ask what next steps might be on this kind of area discussion?
Yeah, so I think I would open it up for, board conversations, but to me, the next steps are, and Mrs. Stein, I guess this falls under policy. I don't know, that's the question, so, but I think what I'm hearing is, to recap it, and we'd want it done before Labor Day, Mrs. Stein, in order to kick off the new school year.
Yes, I mean.
10 days. No, what I'm hearing is from the discussion, great discussion, and again, Rich and team, thank you for all the work behind this. We need to go through and update and align the policy manual to dollar amounts that make sense, to understand what we're doing from collections and donations and gifts and different things like that. And then we need a plan to how we roll it out and educate the public around it. I'll pause there.
Well, I'm not gonna, Marge has a lot to do, but I think it would be helpful if we did a red line version of it with Rich and Marge, and maybe even talk to Meg Gritchie, who's the bursar up at the high school, or any of the other people, just to make sure our practice aligns with the manual, that it works for the people using it. So that's something we can work on and get a red line version.
Yeah, the only thing I would add is that some of the numbers in the manual, like gifts, are IRS driven. So unless the IRS has changed,
Right.
it's really hard for us to change. So,
but our certain thresholds,
so
it's worth looking at. It's been 8 years, so
yeah.
in all of your free time, Marge.
I think the board role is around redlining if there's anything that has to change. Yeah. Implementation really is an administrative issue.
Yes, yeah. But I think we'd like an updated version that aligns with, Mrs. Ackman brings up a good point, and we should stress that in the document, which I think we do around IRS guidelines. But then it's, how do you roll it out? How do you implement it? And I like the concept of whatever reporting we agree on, quarterly or semi-annually, getting back. And then I think there is, as part of rolling this out and educating, the coaches, the team captains, and the captain parents, there does seem to be a challenge with transparency. So I think that would go away with a full rollout and implementation of this process and how it works.
There really, sorry, Mr. Chairman.
No, go ahead.
There really should not be an optic about transparency, but if there is, right? Because I just want to reassure the board and the public in general, right? This is a very thoughtful document that in general is being followed, and we're actually, as things come through the last year and so on and so forth, we're trying to merely align these practices to what we're doing. There's a couple of things like a report that I have to receive on a quarterly basis that I need to make sure that I receive that one too, right? So there's some things in here that we're just aligning to, but the idea that it's just a wild west is just not true, right? And it's important that we don't sort of play into that narrative because it's not accurate. And if there are inconsistencies or people are getting something, then we need to know about it so that we can actually correct it. But I wanted to reassure you that we're in a good place. The recommendation around the scholarship, I just think like $50. I think there just needs to be more latitude for that.
Absolutely.
How many times have we sat around a table where you've said, well, surely we would find something for that student who, right? Well, according to the policy, no, right? So there needs to be a bit more latitude, and well, anyway, we can build that in as a recommendation.
No, I think that makes sense.
And maybe it could be scaled instead of, I mean, again, you'd have to check with IRS code, instead of like a dollar amount, $50, a percentage of overall cost. So we're really helping the student based on the activity trying to be achieved.
Right, that makes sense. Good. Mrs. McCammon?
I think the appropriate flexibility in use of the dollars is really critical, because one of the things that also comes up is because there's not wonderful ways to use the dollars because we're relatively limited, then there's a lot of discussion about sweeping and how that works, and there's concern about the sweeping. So I think, you know, part of that's just the education process about how it works, but part of it is just the real robust way to use those dollars appropriately.
Good, thank you, Mrs. McCammon. So I think the agreement is we will look for a red line update on the document. I think there's consensus that we'll go with the recommendation, which we'll review when it comes back to us, of the change in the dollar amounts from a scholarship standpoint. And then understanding kind of an implementation or an awareness plan that ties to the start of the year about how this, I think to your point, Dr. Adley, a lot of work was done on this. It's a great document. It's like anything, over time, it changes, new people come into play, so it's an awareness, and then we should have kind of an annual or semi-annual plan on awareness and making sure from a reporting standpoint that we're all up to date on this. And Rich, maybe some type of report back to us after all the sweeps are done.
Sure.
To see where we land and how things look. That make sense with everyone? All right,
Yeah.
good.
And the accounting, where do we stand on the accounting adjustment?
And then I guess we can bring that back to a board meeting, making a recommendation on a vote. We can have further discussion on it, to Mrs. Achman's point about it's a little bit of change in philosophy, but everyone should understand her points of those dollars coming back into the operating budget with the goal of them offsetting costs associated with those events. But if you're gonna bring that recommendation back to the board, Rich. All right, good. Oh, okay. Hello, Mrs. Stein. With that, we are at our lunch break. Food is set up. I think we'd like to get back to the meeting as quick as possible. We've got an hour scheduled here. Do you want to go for 20 minutes, 15 or 20 minutes, or 30 minutes?
I'd love to get started at
12:30.